Chapter 454, Returning Home, 1, the corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. Nothing good ever happened each time she met Prince Jean. He hadn't left a shred of mercy in his words for her. Didn't he know that women hated being called fat? Furthermore, it was the frail-looking and thin type of beauty that was favored in the Great Wu dynasty. Chu Lian managed to squeeze out an awkward smile for Prince Jean before introducing Sima Hui to him. Sima Hui had a straightforward and brave air to her because she spent so much time in the army. She had traded the reserve that most noble ladies had for an easygoing and dignified attitude. Somehow, the fourth prince who rarely interacted with unfamiliar ladies got along with her rather well. Chu Lian followed behind them while holding the reins of her mare, looking at their backs with the spark of an idea forming. The author of the original story had only mentioned Sima Hui in a single line. From what she knew, the fourth prince had never even met Sima Hui before. However, the two of them seemed like old friends right now. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were sparkling bright now. Even her lips had tilted upwards in a curve. Just as she was immersed in her thoughts, her horse suddenly changed directions and tried to head towards the side of the road, giving her a fright. When she quickly turned to look, she realized that it was all He Sanlang's doing. She complained, "He Changdi. What are you doing?" He Sanlang turned to her with a faint smile as he continued leading her horse away. "Teaching you to ride." Chu Lian cried out in alarm as the gentle mare under her suddenly started galloping. Her face turned pale from fright. Just as she felt as if she were going to fall off the horse, something tightened around her waist and pulled her up into the air. When she finally regained her senses, she was already sitting on He Changdi's mount. Chu Lian was still in a panicked state. She gripped tightly onto He Sanlang's narrow waist once she was ensconced in his embrace. Despite having only one hand on the reins and one arm around Chu Lian, He Changdi was at ease even as his steed was galloping freely. As they traveled under the clear sky, there was a warm and genial smile on He Sanlang's face that had never been seen before even in his past life. Once Chu Lian had recovered her breath, she pinched his arm forcefully in anger. He Changdi's eye twitched in pain. He lowered his gaze helplessly. "Chu Lian, if you continue pinching me that hard, I'll lose my grip on the reins and will really fall off the horse." Chu Lian glared at him fiercely. "You're not allowed to do that anymore." He Sanlang looked down and placed a kiss on her smooth, flushed cheek. "Then you can't let anyone else teach you how to ride next time. Only I'm allowed to teach you. I know how to ride now, so there's no need for you to teach me." It wasn't hard to ride a horse. The hard part was getting used to the bumpy ride. He Changdi raised an eyebrow in question. "Are you sure you've already learned how to ride?" Chu Lian refused to give in. "Didn't you watch me just now? I was riding that horse perfectly well." Just as Chu Lian finished speaking, He Changdi urged his horse on with a low shout. The handsome steed responded by opening up its stride and flying into a gallop. The scenery on either side turned into a blur and the ride turned even more bumpy. Chu Lian was frightened by the sudden speed and clung tightly onto He Changdi. Somehow, she could still hear He Changdi's husky, magnetic voice by her ear. "Are you still sure that you know how to ride a horse?" Chu Lian had already realized that this fellow was purposely teasing her. Her cheeks were flushed red with anger as she exclaimed, "He Changdi, why are you so childish?" The only response she could hear through the winds blowing past was He Changdi's bright and open laughter, which she could feel through his shaking chest. Chu Lian was startled. She couldn't help but look up at He Changdi's sharp jaw. Right now, he had lost all of the gloominess that had always been present on his face ever since she had met him. He was genuinely and truly living in this happy and warm moment now. Chu Lian suddenly had the urge to freeze time to keep him in his current state, freed of all his worries and burdens. She tightened her hold around him and buried her head into his chest. Having lost all desire to retort to him, she broke out into a wholehearted smile. By the time the couple returned to the group, an hour had already passed. The fierce winds they had encountered on horseback had messed up their cloaks, so Sanlang and Chu Lian both looked a little haggard. However, the messiness of their clothes couldn't hide the pure joy on their faces. Changdi personally escorted Chu Lian to her carriage. Xiao Hongyu eyed the two of them from not too far away with shining eyes. He tsked to himself and let out a chuckle with a wretched expression. Doesn't brother he know how to control himself? We're still on the road here. He just took sister-in-law out like that. Zhang Mai had no idea what to say to the brat. He glared at him and threw a chestnut at his silly head. You little brat. What are you thinking of in that head of yours? Xiao Hongyu held his wounded head in a pitiful manner and protested, Brother Zhang, you're not allowed to hit my head. My mother already thinks I'm stupid enough. If you keep hitting my head, I won't be able to get a wife in the future. Captain Guo burst out into raucous laughter while watching the two banter. The victory in the war against the Tuhuns had lifted the mood of their long-suffering soldiers. They entered the capital on the second day of the second month of the lunar calendar, the day of the Longtatu festival. The Qingping Emperor had sent officials from the Ministry of Rites to welcome them 5 kilometers out from the capital. General Qian and his troops would have to change into special ceremonial armor and enter the capital under the lead of the officials armed with ceremonial weapons. They would then enter the palace for the official bestowal ceremony. This was the highest honor that could be given to a military official returning home. It was also due to this arrangement that Prince Jin and Chu Lian had to part ways with the border troops when they were close to the outskirts of the capital. Chapter 455, Returning Home, 2. At the 5-kilometer mark out from the capital, Chu Lian bid goodbye to He Changdi and followed He Erlang back into the capital. As for He Sanlang's party, they would have to head straight to the palace to attend the ceremony before they would be allowed to return to their estates. In the afternoon, Chu Lian finally reached the entrance of the Jingan estate. They had already sent some of their family's soldiers ahead to report their return. Just as Chu Lian's carriage stopped, the sound of excited female voices carried in from outside. Third young madam, you're finally back. Xian had been trying to put on the steady air that a handmaid should have, but who could have thought that she would lose control of her emotions even before seeing Chu Lian in person? Her voice was almost close to a sob. Wenqing, who had been seated in the carriage with Chu Lian, leaped out to lift the curtains covering the entrance of the carriage. She shot a speechless look at Xian before teasing her, you missed third young madam that much? What are you blanking out for? Come and help third young madam out. It was only then that Xian came to her senses and looked up into the carriage. As expected, she was met with the sight of Chu Lian trying to hide a warm smile. She quickly wiped away the tears in the corners of her eyes and reached out to hold Chu Lian steady. Third young madam, please excuse this servant. Chu Lian let Xian help her out of the carriage before speaking with affection, all right, that's enough. I'll forgive you this time. Once she was out of the carriage, Chu Lian spotted the group of people standing at the entrance. The one in the lead was the kindly matriarch He. Her mother-in-law, Countess Jingan, was standing right next to her with the help of Miaozhen. Chu Lian's gaze slid down to Miaozhen and she noticed that her clothes were loose, while her belly seemed to have swelled a little. A brief wave of emotion passed through her. She hadn't expected Miaozhen to have gotten pregnant with her brother-in-law's child so quickly. Her gaze shifted again, only to be met with two strangers. A middle-aged woman was standing to matriarch He's right. Her face was rounded and she was dressed richly. However, that unbridled measuring look she had on her face only drew dislike. If she looked a little closely, the middle-aged woman's features were a little similar to matriarch He. Standing behind the middle-aged woman was a tall young lady. The young lady seemed to be about her age. She was dressed in a bright pink dress with a vest on top. An exquisite fox fur-lined cloak was wrapped around her. The strings of pearls on her golden hairpin shook gently in the breeze. Her outfit seemed strangely familiar to Chu Lien's eyes. The girl seemed a little timid as she shied away from meeting Chu Lien's eyes directly. She darted glances at Chu Lien from underneath her lowered lashes from time to time. Xian noticed the misgivings in her master's eyes and whispered behind her, "Third young madam, those two are eldest madam and Miss Pan. They returned to the estate right before the new year." Eldest madam. Miss Pan. Chu Lien thought back to the events described in the story, but it seemed like those two had never been mentioned at all. However, she had heard her mother-in-law mention that the matriarch had a daughter who had married far away. Why had they suddenly been brought back to the capital? Although Chu Lien had some doubts in her heart, she didn't show them on her face. She smiled sweetly and quickly walked towards matriarch He. When she was right in front of the matriarch, she curtsied respectfully before saying, "Granddaughter-in-law hopes grandmother is well. Granddaughter-in-law has returned." Following that, she bobbed towards Countess Jingan and the rest. Matriarch He held on to Chu Lien's arm. "It's good that you're back." "Good, good. Quick, come into the estate. Look at how thin you've gotten, you must have lost so much weight." In the time it took to enter the estate, Ying had already spoken up, "Mother, this must be Audi's wife. Why don't you introduce us? It's my first time meeting this child." Matriarch He smiled, "What are you in such a hurry for? Lianer has just returned. You have to let her take a sip of hot tea first at the very least. You'll have all the time in the world to chat with your niece later on." Since the matriarch hadn't acquiesced to her demand, Ying pouted and followed matriarch He closely. Pan Nianzhen's eyes hadn't left Chu Lien once, even as she continued following behind her mother. Now that Chu Lien was in front of her, she didn't have to meet those piercing eyes that made her feel ashamed. She could rest easy and look her over all she wanted. She hadn't expected Chu Lien to be so young. She looked about the same age as her, although she was much shorter. Chu Lien was also dressed very casually. There was only a single dark green jade hairpin on her head and a lovely jade ring on her left thumb. She wasn't even wearing a single bangle. Pan Nianzhen felt that her looks weren't that bad and could be considered above average even in the capital. In the past, her face had been her pride. However, upon seeing the unadorned, fine features of Chu Lien, she suddenly felt inferior. Even though Chu Lien wasn't wearing any makeup at all, her face was still as beautiful as a flower. Pan Nianzhen trembled at the thought of comparing her looks with Chu Lien now. Pan Nianzhen crumpled the handkerchief in her hands and took in a deep breath. A thread of dissatisfaction wound around her heart. When she had heard that Chu Lien and He Sanlang would be returning to the estate today, she had specially ordered her maidservant to pick out the best outfit and accessories to dress her up. However, she couldn't even match up to Chu Lien in her plain and simple clothes. What Pan Nianzhen didn't understand was that some things couldn't be earned with outer appearances alone. The jealousy in her heart built up until it was showing in her eyes. She had visited Chu Lien's Songtao court before. When she had inadvertently glanced at the book that one of the servants had been writing in, there had been lines of accessories recorded there that were all more valuable than whatever she had on now. However, Chu Lien hadn't worn any of those beautiful and lavish accessories and had dressed so simply. Was she trying to humiliate her and her mother? Chapter 456, Trifling Matters in the Estate. 1. Chu Lien followed Matriarch He and the others into Qingxi Hall. She had gone to the northern border with a mission. Although her letters had already informed the elders in the family of important matters such as the war or the Snow Mountain Mist Flower, there were many details Matriarch He was unsure of and wanted to hear straight from the source. In Qingxi Hall, everyone was seated while Chu Lien was pulled to sit by Matriarch He's side. The matriarch took a good look at Chu Lien from head to toe. It had only been half a year since they last met, but Chu Lian had actually changed a lot in that time. The baby fat on her face had receded, leaving only the charm and delicate beauty of a young lady. Her almond-shaped eyes were like clear springs, giving the impression that she could see through one's heart. Her figure had also become even more shapely than when she had left home. Although she had slimmed down a little, her body was more like an hourglass now. Her simple, unadorned robes were unable to conceal her resplendent beauty. The matriarch nodded inwardly. This journey had forged her granddaughter-in-law's inner radiance. When she was younger, she had traveled extensively with the previous count, fighting on the battlefield and killing bandits and foes. She had only settled down into the inner court when she had grown older. If not for the perspective she had gained from her time journeying in her youth that put her in a different league from other noble ladies, she wouldn't have been able to build such a large empire for House Jingan when she returned to the capital. That was why she believed that ladies should not be confined to the boundaries of their own courtyard. Ladies also had to get out of their comfort zone and experience the outside world. It was precisely this train of thought that led her to allow Sanlang's wife to embark on the journey to the north. Discovering this change in Chu Lian obviously made her happy. As the matriarch looked at her lovable granddaughter-in-law, her gaze subconsciously drifted to Chu Lian's flat tummy. When she noticed Chu Lian's broad belt emphasizing her slender waist, she couldn't help but reveal a tiny bit of disappointment in her eyes. The fact that she was wearing such a tight-fitting outfit meant that she definitely wasn't pregnant. While the matriarch was sizing up Chu Lian had been watching her with a smile. Thus, she had immediately caught that speck of disappointment in the matriarch's eyes. She didn't show any reaction to what she had noticed, but she took down a mental note. Compared to how Chu Lian had grown taller and become more beautiful, matriarchy on the other hand, looked much older than before. Her gray hair had faded completely into white. The number of wrinkles on her round face seemed to have increased significantly. Her robes also seemed loose on her, indicating that she had lost a fair bit of weight. These observations made Chu Lian sigh inside. Before the matriarch could speak, Chu Lian asked, "Grandmother, you haven't introduced Aunt to me yet." It was only then that matriarchy returned to reality. She smacked her own thigh in vexation. "Oh dear me, my mind isn't what it used to be. I've become more forgetful in my old age." She took Chu Lian's slender white hand into hers and pointed towards the middle-aged woman next to her. In a friendly tone, she introduced, "Sanlang's wife, this is your aunt. She became a widow several years ago. This autumn, I sent some servants to bring her back from Siang. The lady over there is your cousin, Miss Pan, the sole daughter of your aunt. She was born just 2 months after you, so the two of you are of the same age. Do take care of her in the future." Chu Lian stood up to give her aunt-in-law, Ying, a formal greeting before turning to Pan Nianjun to give a less formal curtsy towards her peer. If not for the sake of giving matriarchy face, Chu Lian didn't have to greet them so respectfully at all. Setting aside the fact that He Chengda's new title of Marquis meant that she was now a Marchioness, she already had the title of Honored Lady Genie. With her noble title, she didn't need to curtsy to Ying and her daughter, who were practically commoners. Ying looked at the plainly dressed Chu Lian and nodded haughtily. Although Pan Nianjun was jealous of Chu Lian, she was a timid person at heart, so she stood up properly to return the curtsy and greeted her, third cousin. Chu Lian shot Xian a look and the handmaid promptly hurried forward to hand over 2 exquisite pouches to her. She gave one pouch to her aunt-in-law Ying, and the other to Pan Nianjun. With a smile, Chu Lian said, "These are just some trinkets I purchased in Sioux City. I hope aunt and cousin will like these." Ying opened the pouch on the spot, and dumped out what was inside onto her palm. It was a white jade bangle. Judging from the smooth and glossy surface, she could tell that it was made of high-grade white jade at first glance. The arrogance in her eyes finally faded a little as satisfaction shone in her gaze. However, the fact that she didn't even thank Chu Lian made the matriarch throw a few looks her way for a bit. Chu Lian was stunned for a moment by the lack of reaction from the two. Eventually, she let it go and went back to her own seat calmly. Chu Lian told them about her experiences at the northern border. But of course, she hit some major events such as getting kidnapped, opening a market at the north, and He Changdi getting hurt. An hour later, Matriarchy was visibly getting tired, so Chu Lian tactfully mentioned that she wanted to return to Songtao Court to settle some tasks. Matriarchy allowed her to leave and told her to have a good rest. After some other pleasantries, she asked Chu Lian to have dinner here in Qingxi Hall later with Yi Changdi. Chapter 457, Trifling Matters in the Estate 2. Once Chu Lian had left, Matriarchy immediately reprimanded He Ying. What were you doing? You've already lived for decades, yet your manners lost out to a young lady who has just come of age. You're the elder, but you didn't even have a first meeting gift for your junior. You even had Sanlang's wife give you a gift out of filial piety. The moment Matriarchy chastised her, He Ying lowered her head and turned on the waterworks. The matriarch was angered further by her sobbing and crying. Think about how old you are now. Yet all you know how to do is cry. What happened to your fierce streak from the past? After this continued for some time, He Ying finally explained while sobbing, Mother, did you think I didn't want to? It's not like you aren't aware of the situation we're in. Despite how I'm dressed today, every single of these items from head to toe all belong to you. Sanlang's wife is an honored lady. The palace sends out jewelry for the titled ladies during the new year or other festivities. Sanlang's wife was able to casually give out this high-grade white jade. How could I have something suitable to gift her? Even if I did have something to give, she wouldn't fancy it. In any case, we're broke, so why should we care about dignity? What her daughter said tugged on Matriarchy's heartstrings, so she completely forgot about the rudeness He Ying had just displayed towards her granddaughter-in-law here in the parlor. Matriarchy sighed, forget it, forget it. I'm tired. Take Miss Pan back to your room to rest and come back here for dinner. He Ying obediently got up and left with Pan Yinjin, but the moment she left the parlor, she couldn't help breaking out into a smirk. After leaving Qingxi Hall, Chu Lian didn't go directly to Songtao Court. Instead, she went looking for Great Dr. Miao and carefully placed the Snow Mountain Mist's flower into his hands for verification. With a glance, Great Dr. Miao was able to confirm that it was the Snow Mountain Mists, and he sighed in relief. Thank goodness third young madam returned in time. The treatment for this illness can't be delayed for much longer. Rest assured, third young madam, as long as this Snow Mountain Mists is used, I have a 70% chance of curing the Countess' old illness completely. Chu Lian curtsied respectfully towards Great Dr. Miao, which he accepted gracefully. He took the medicine and quickly went to the medicine room that House Jingon had prepared for him. By the time she returned to her own courtyard, another hour had already passed. Finally, Chu Lian had time to change her clothes and cleanse her body. She then laid on the sofa and shut her eyes for a quick nap. After napping for half an hour, Chu Lian got up to drink a cup of honey water and summoned senior servant Gui and Xian for a chat. Has anything happened while I was away? Senior servant Gui spoke first. Third young madam, Ming Yan has passed on. Chu Lian was startled, but she didn't reveal any other emotions on her face. There was no need to sympathize with someone who had betrayed her, so she simply asked, has she been buried? Senior servant Gui nodded. Xian gave some silvers to the manservants at the corner gate to buy a casket and have her buried. They didn't have much affection for Ming Yan here, so after exchanging a few words, they changed the topic. Xian handed the account books to Chu Lian, before passing on Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia's messages to her. Finally she said, third young madam, Gillen Restaurant is still under the public accounts. It's already the second month of the year, but it remains closed. The matriarch has sent senior servant Lu to inquire about it several times. To prevent Gillen restaurant from getting stolen, Xian had followed the solution that Chu Lian had left behind and closed Gillen restaurant. However, as a restaurant, Gillen restaurant couldn't possibly stay closed forever. Even if they didn't mind, their regular customers would probably come to the estate to make a fuss eventually. Amongst them was old Duke Xing, who was someone they couldn't afford to offend. Chu Lian smiled. "You don't need to worry about this, I'll settle it." Hearing that made Xian relieved. Now that their masters had returned, they finally had a pillar to lean on, and they could stand tall as servants. After dealing with these important matters, Xian suddenly recalled the matter of Miss Pan coming to Songtao Court to borrow clothes. Third young madam, as Miss Pan came to the estate in a hurry, she didn't have enough clothes. "The new clothes that were made for you last year have all been borrowed by her." Realization dawned upon Chu Lian. It was no wonder she had found Pan Nianzhen's clothes so familiar. Those were the winter clothes made with materials that she had personally picked out. It seemed like Miss Pan wasn't actually as timid as she seemed. She was obviously a white lotus, someone who looked pure and innocent on the surface but was scheming inside. Chu Lian's fair fingertips tapped on the side of the teacup. "Momo, have someone investigate this new aunt of mine." Senior servant Gue beamed until her eyes turned into crescents. She could feel that third young madam had become even more mature after returning from her journey. Previously, she had only cared about matters regarding Songtao Court, but now she had learned to be vigilant and observant towards others. "Understood. This old servant will have it done, third young madam." As she spoke, senior servant Gue couldn't help but size up Chu Lian's body. Chu Lian rolled her eyes at her speechlessly. "I haven't even consummated my marriage." "Momo, you should stop overthinking things." Senior servant Gue and Xian's eyes widened. They had disbelief written all over their faces. The fact that she and He Changdi had not consummated their marriage was only known to the two of them as Chu Lian's close aides. They hadn't thought that the couple still hadn't consummated their marriage even after their trip to the northern border, so even senior servant Gue was starting to feel anxious. Previously, when He Sanlang had gone to the northern border with no known date of return, she had turned a blind eye when Chu Lian acted willfully, but things were different now. He Sanlang had become a marquis from his military accomplishments, and their third young madam was now a marchioness. Count Jingan was still alive now, but the day would come when Count Jingan passes his title to his heir. House Jingan's third branch would have to break away from the family then. Chu Lian's first son would then become the heir of Marquis An Yuan. Now that this concerned the survival of a noble house, it was a problem of epic proportions that they still hadn't consummated their marriage. Chapter 458, The Department of Appointments, 1. As Chu Lian's former wet nurse, senior servant Gue couldn't help but remind her, "Third young madam, it won't do for you and third young master to keep delaying this." Even without considering the future, they had the matriarch to deal with right now. The matriarch was expecting a great-grandson soon. There was also the sudden appearance of that eldest madam and Miss Pan. From how the mother and daughter pair had been acting, it was unlikely that they would be easy to get along with. They had managed to escape from the remote Xi'an to the glamorous capital, so it would be crazy to think that they would want to go back. If they didn't want to go back, getting Miss Pan to marry into the He family would be the best choice for them. Despite the fact that the second young master wasn't married yet, third young master was the most outstanding one amongst the brothers, so it was hard to say with certainty that Miss Pan wouldn't set her sights on him. Chu Lian knew that senior servant Gue was speaking out of consideration for her, but having such things spoken outright still made her blush. "Momo, I understand that. My husband was injured for some time before, so I've already promised him to consummate our marriage after we return to the estate." Chu Lian's words were a pleasant surprise to Xian and even more so for senior servant Gue. She couldn't help grabbing onto Chu Lian's hands. "Sixth miss, as long as your first child is a boy, your position in House Jingan will be secured." Senior servant Gue was so overcome with emotion that she had actually called Chu Lian by her previous title from House Xing. Once Chu Lian had an heir by her side, it wouldn't matter even if He Changdi's love for her changed. Her position in the He family would be as unshakable as a rock. Taking Dalong's wife as an example, if Madame Zhou had a son, her relationship with He Changqi wouldn't have deteriorated to this point. If she had a son, even if she quarreled with her husband, the matriarch and the countess would have considered taking her side. In any case, no matter how high one's status was, there was still a need to birth a male heir as a noble's legitimate wife. Senior servant Gue wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. This was just how noble families were in the Great Wu dynasty. House Jingan was better as there were fewer members and the men never took concubines. Otherwise, things would be worse than they already were. Chu Lian had never considered such matters in the past. She had only thought about how she could live her days well as a lazy bug who never lacked money. Things were different now that she and He Changdi were in love. She naturally thought of sharing in some of his burdens. It wouldn't do for her to remain a layabout then. She didn't know what kind of post the emperor would give to He Changdi currently. If he received an important position, then as his wife, she would have to start socializing with others. For a whole afternoon, Chu Lian settled the many trivial matters in Songtao court. The Li siblings who had escorted her to the northern border had also returned to Prince Wei's estate after completing their mission. Chu Lian had ordered the siblings to bring back the presents she had gotten for Princess Wei and Princess Duanjie too. Chu Lian also ordered the servants to send the local specialties she had bought on her journey to the various branches of the family. By the time she was done, it was already evening. A burst of noise started from the entrance of the courtyard. Xian went off to take a look and happily returned to report, "Third young madam, third young master has returned." Chu Lian set aside the accounts that she had been looking through and ordered Fuyan and Jingyan to prepare a change of clothes for He Changdi. He Changdi was still clad in his silver ceremonial armor when he entered the estate. He headed straight to the bedroom after entering Songtao court. Chu Lian, who was right beside her desk, turned to see him walking in with big strides. She found it a little strange. "Why are you in such a rush? Is something the matter?" He Changdi set down the helmet he had been holding and took a seat by the desk without even changing his clothes. He beckoned Chu Lian over. Thinking that he had an emergency to discuss with her, Chu Lian quickly went to his side. However, before she could even open her mouth to ask, He Changdi had already wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her into his embrace. With his tall build, his head was still at the level of Chu Lian's chin even when he was seated, which was why it was so easy for him to pull her into his embrace. The servants nearby were all shocked by the intimate actions between third young master and third young madam. In the end, it was the experienced senior servant Gue who quickly shot a signal at Xian with her eyes and had Xian chase the other servants out. Jingyan and Fuyan, who had just come out from the bathroom, were also dragged away by Xian. It had been months since Fuyan had last seen He Changdi. Third young master had become more mature and steadfast than before, and his face seemed more masculine and handsome. He looked like a diamond that had just come out of the rough, which made it even harder for women to draw their eyes away from him. When third young master pulled third young madam into his arms, there was a little more warmth and tenderness on his icy countenance. This was a third young master that no one in the whole of Songtao court had ever witnessed. Greed brewed in Fuyan's heart. A tinge of darkness flashed in her eyes as she wished fervently that she could be the one in third young master's arms at this moment. Fuyan's hands curled into fists under her long and broad sleeves. After one last look of longing, she was finally dragged out of the room by Xian. Chu Lian was feeling uncomfortable with her waist being squeezed and her body pressed flush on his cold armor. She pushed He Sanlang away and spoke with a blush, the servants were still here earlier, can't you be more aware of your surroundings? With a cold expression that was at odds with his loving actions, Sanlang rested his head on Chu Lien's slender shoulders. They were so close that Chu Lien could hear his heart pounding hard. Chang's deep and magnetic voice resounded close to her ears. His Majesty has conferred the position of a 5th-ranked administrator of the Department of Appointments to me. A 5th-ranked administrator of the Department of Appointments? Chu Lien was so astounded that she didn't have the mind to pay attention to Sanlang's misbehaving hands. Chapter 459, The Department of Appointments, 2. Chu Lien had just taken a bath in the afternoon and the main bedroom of Songtao Court was warm and comfortable, so she was only wearing a loose and comfy casual dress, which turned out to be to his benefit. Chang's slightly coarse palm slid right into her dress. He then gently caressed the smooth skin at her waist. Chu Lien's mind was churning at lightning speed. Although she wasn't well versed in the bureaucratic system of the Great Wu Dynasty, she still knew a little. The system used in the Great Wu Dynasty was pretty much the same as the Ming Dynasty from history. Back in the Ming Dynasty, there were 4 official departments recognized by all as the most lucrative: the Ministry of Personnel's Departments of Administration and Examinations and the Ministry of War's Departments of Appointments and Logistics. Changdi had just been given a position at one of these lucrative departments. Although his rank wasn't very high, he did hold actual authority. A 5th-ranked administrator like him could stand up to a 1st-ranked official with an empty post. Any military official would have to go through his department in order to get transferred to other posts. It was only when the large hand sneaking around in her clothes gradually reached up and touched the ties holding her underclothes closed that she finally returned to her senses. She pulled down Sanlang's misbehaving hands and glared at him. Feeling a little speechless, she said, "You're going to be facing trouble soon. How do you still have the mood to play around? What do you think His Majesty's intentions are? Your achievements at the northern border are already eye-catching on their own and the bestowal of your Marquisate is unprecedented. Why would he still give you a position like this? Isn't this practically drawing a target on your back? The Qingping Emperor was playing a game of chess here, but doesn't he know that tall trees attract the woodman's axe? Bestowing a Marquisate on Sanlang and giving him a lucrative post, just what was the Emperor trying to do?" Changdi had only been mentioning this to Chu Lien offhandedly. He hadn't expected her to have read so deeply into it. So this little woman who normally only thought of how to eat better actually knew how to navigate the twists and turns in the imperial court. He had truly underestimated her in the past. At this point of time, Chu Lien was like a great treasure that had been discovered in the mud and Sanlang was the one who had discovered her. Each time he found out how different she was, it felt as if his treasure had multiplied. He was both astonished and delighted. After recovering from his astonishment, he burst into a bout of open laughter. "Chu Lien, why aren't you happy that I've gotten such a lucrative post? Why are you complaining about your husband's position instead?" Chu Lien pushed at him, trying to break free from his embrace, but his muscular arms were like steel prongs, they simply refused to budge. She rolled her eyes at him. "There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world." Changdi tightened his arms around her. "Don't move, let me hug you for a little longer." As he spoke, he rested his head back on Chu Lien's shoulder. Chu Lien assumed that he was trying to think, so she stopped struggling and stayed still. A good while later, Changdi said, "Xiao Bojian has gone to the Ministry of Personnel. Although he isn't in the Department of Administration, it's still an important position." Changdi's words made Chu Lien stiffen up as she found this hard to believe. If that was the case, then she found it even harder to understand the Qingping Emperor's intentions. Furthermore, in this life, Xiao Bojian was actually climbing up the ranks quicker than he had in the book. It had to be emphasized that in the original book, it was with the help of Chu Lien along with House Ying's full support that Jad managed to enter the Ministry of Personnel 1 year from now. Who could have thought that his rise would be so much faster this time? Chu Lian was in He Changdi's embrace right now, so even though she hadn't made much movement, He Changdi detected the subtle stiffening of her body. He raised his head to look at her and stared into her clear eyes. He Changdi still didn't understand her. After numerous tests, he had confirmed that Chu Lian wasn't interested in Xiao Wujing at all. Furthermore, her disinterest went further than that. She was actually disgusted by him. Yet whenever he mentioned Xiao Wujing, there would be an obvious and strange reaction from his wife. It didn't seem like she was completely ignorant of Xiao Wujing's plight. He Changdi's eyes darkened. He had a faint feeling that Chu Lian was concealing something from him. Although he wasn't happy about that, if he turned to look at it from another perspective, he still had his whole lifetime ahead to spend with her. There was no need to worry that she would keep him in the dark forever. The couple cuddled for a while before Chu Lian urged He Changdi to take a bath and change out of his clothes. It was getting late and they still had to rush to Qingxi Hall for their reunion dinner. After he finished bathing, He Changdi donned a navy blue robe and a black cape with a qilin embroidered on the lower half. These were clothes that the estate had specially made for him this winter. He Changdi was a lot more well-built than before after training in the army. He had broad shoulders, a slim waist, and long muscular legs. He wasn't too slender and lanky, but he wasn't overly muscular and burly either. The robes complemented his tall and slightly muscular build perfectly. Even Chu Lian couldn't keep her eyes off him. When He Sanlang noticed her unending stare, a spark of delight flared up within him. However, his face remained as icy as ever. He even pretended to be indifferent as he said, "Have you stared enough? If you have, then come and tie my hair for me." Chu Lian didn't bother bickering with this weirdo and beckoned him over. "Come on, sit over here." He Sanlang walked to the dressing table and sat down obediently like a good puppy. Chu Lian then picked up the sandalwood comb on the table and started combing and tying up his hair. Thankfully, the simple hairstyle that Chu Lian had done was still passable. Once she stuck a white jade crown with a design that matched the hairpin she wore on his head, He Sanlang's poker face finally regained some color. He glanced at his own image in the mirror, coughed twice, and managed to squeeze out some praise. "Not too bad." TL note: I couldn't find an official translation for the departments mentioned here, so I did some research on them and came up with approximate titles. So if you were an official in the Ming Dynasty, these are the 4 departments that are known to be lucrative posts. Why? It's because these were seen as easy jobs with the likelihood of bribes coming your way. Ministry of Personnel, Department of Administration, Department of Examinations, Ministry of War, Department of Appointments, Department of Logistics. I think it's quite clear why for the departments of examinations and appointments, as you can bribe these officials to smooth your way through the ranks. Even for upstanding officials, it's standard to give gifts in celebration/gratitude for promotions, etc. The Department of Administration is in charge of improving bureaucratic processes. From my own perspective, maybe you could bribe officials to push for a certain process that's beneficial for you. Not a historian in any way. LOL. The Department of War, Logistics is quite clear too, because war supplies would be a huge source of income for merchants. Some bribes going the way of the administrator could help you get that business. Oh whoa. Chapter 460, Reunion at Qingxi Hall. 1. Chu Lian glanced at his reddened ears with a smile and didn't argue with him. "Alright, I'm just going to change my clothes in the bathroom before we go over. Otherwise, well, make grandmother wait." After she finished speaking, Chu Lian turned and entered the bathroom. Xian had already prepared a change of clothing for her in the bathroom. Once Chu Lian had left the inner room, He Sanlang checked his reflection in the bronze mirror. Although it was just a normal hairstyle, he felt more and more satisfied as he looked at it. In the end, he broke out into a foolish smile. Luckily, the maidservants of Songtao Court didn't catch him in his current state, or they would most likely have knelt for hours out of fright, thinking that their third young master was possessed. While waiting for Chu Lian to return from the bathroom, San Lang had already turned back to his usual cold and stern self. He sat by the table and picked up a storybook that he had seen Chu Lian reading often to pass the time. His brows creased together as he read. What was this story about? An abandoned wife living carefree. In the Great Wu dynasty, abandoned wives didn't even have a place in society, let alone being able to spend their days leisurely. Flipping back to the front of the book to look for the author's name, Changdi snorted. Was this Snow Mountain Mists crazy? Their imagination was just too far-fetched. From what he could see, this person had probably been born with a hole in their head. His wife would come up with peculiar ideas from time to time. Could that have been due to reading Snow Mountain Mists books? Changdi's heart was set afire with rage. He wanted to burn up this book. While Changdi was thinking, a sound from behind caught his attention. When he looked up and turned towards Chu Lian's direction, his deep eyes immediately lit up. Chu Lian had grown a little taller after coming back from the northern border, and her old clothes didn't fit as well anymore. The newest garments made for her over the winter had been borrowed by Miss Pan, so she was wearing a dress that Princess Wei had given her right now. The dress was a bright red with complex patterns embroidered on the hem, cuffs, and neckline. The buttons were glossy pearls of the same size. Even though it was a winter garment, it was cut with a narrow waist that showed off Chu Lian's slim figure. Changdi had actually never seen Chu Lian all dressed up before. He had always known that she was beautiful and that her looks were considered outstanding even within the capital. He used to hate her face so much that he didn't even want to look at her. Thus, he was completely stunned right now. The young lady reflected in his deep gaze was as breathtaking as the sunrise. When Chu Lian noticed his dazed expression, she tilted her head to one side with a smile, looking utterly adorable. What's wrong? Have you been stunned by my beauty? San Lang's body stiffened up as a twitch developed in the corner of his mouth. How had he been so foolish before? How could someone who could speak such shameless words be the former wicked woman Chu Lian? How had he been so blind? He had made himself so constrained and miserable. Changdi tugged the corner of his lips downwards before ordering in a cold tone, "Let's go." Chu Lian knew that he was just shy and uncomfortable, so she ran after him with a giggle. After taking a few long strides forward, San Lang suddenly noticed that he had lost sight of Chu Lian behind him. He unconsciously came to a stop when he heard the sound of footsteps coming closer. As he stood in the corridor, lanterns cast a faint light on him from behind, accentuating his perfect posture and making him appear even taller and more handsome. It was only when the sound of footsteps in disarray drew closer that Changdi turned slightly and looked behind him. He was met with the sight of a young lady holding the heavy hem of her dress chasing after him and trying to close the remaining distance of a few steps between them. The sound of her complaints came next. Changdi, why are you walking so fast? When Chu Lian finally reached Changdi's side, a sudden warmth encased her right hand, which had been hanging naturally by her side. By the time she came to her senses, her right hand was already in the grip of a large and slightly rough palm. Changdi snorted, "You're really useless. Why are you walking so slowly?" Chu Lian was about to glare at him in response, when she was suddenly lifted into the air. She had actually been scooped up into a bridal carry by Changdi. All the maidservants following behind them quickly lowered their heads and kept their distance from their masters. Xian felt very pressured. What was wrong with third young master? Why had he suddenly started going all lovey-dovey with third young madam without any warning? Could he not treat the servants like air and give them some time to react? Chu Lian shot a glance at the maidservants following along at a distance and turned to give San Lang a helpless glare. Beaming from ear to ear, she fired off a question with a double meaning, "I might be slow, but aren't you going to wait for me?" Changdi paused in his steps. His eyes seemed as dark as night against the light. Chu Lian knew that he was staring at her. She could even feel his warm breath on her face. It doesn't matter how slow you walk in the future. It'll just carry you along just like this. You'll definitely be able to catch up to me. He Sanlang was usually socially awkward, so it was extremely rare to see him saying such warm and romantic words. It was even more heartwarming to hear such gentle words coming from a cold person like him. Even Chu Lian wasn't able to withstand his attack. Utterly defeated, she drowned in his tender love for her. She wrapped her arms around He Chengdi's neck and buried her little head in his broad chest. He Chengdi put some strength into his arms and lifted Chu Lian up a little more. After a short pause, he stated in a seemingly serious manner, "His Highness was right, you really are heavier than before." Chu Lian had still been immersed in his earlier sweetness. His remark immediately jolted her out of her daze and sent her into a fury. Grinding her teeth with hatred, she clamped her teeth on He Chengdi's slender neck. Her little canines were really powerful. In her moment of impulse, Chu Lian didn't hold back, leaving 2 red rows of teeth marks on his pale neck. At times, she was able to see things even more clearly than her mother. It was true that it would be the best if she could marry her second cousin. However, young girls at her age tended to have fantasies about love and be a little rebellious. Her heart beat uncontrollably when she thought back to that day at Plum Pavilion in Prince Weiss' estate and that unexpected glimpse. She had grown up in a small town in Xi'an and she had never seen such a perfect man before. Furthermore, he had purposely turned towards her with a gentle smile. At that moment, it was as if all the plum blossoms around her had bloomed at once. The elegant fragrance of plum blossoms had filled her head. It was hard for her to forget. How could there be such a good-looking man in this world? Later on, she had asked around and discovered that he was the top scholar from last year and old Duke Ying's prized disciple. The emperor had placed him in an important position despite his young age. Furthermore, he wasn't engaged yet. She had heard that his parents died early and his family had been poor. The only reason he had been able to participate in the imperial examination was due to the support of old Duke Ying. Since he wasn't from a noble house, there was nothing standing in the way of her becoming his wife. No matter what, she was currently a legitimate-born young miss of House Jinggan and Marquis Enyuan's cousin. As long as her mother was willing to bring it up with grandmother and as long as her third cousin-in-law was willing to put in a good word for her when she visited her maiden home, then it wasn't impossible for her to marry Xiao Bojian. While her second cousin was good, she still preferred the dangerously handsome top scholar, Xiao Bojian. If she could marry him, her uncle could also provide him some guidance and support. She would also be able to stand proudly in front of Xiao Bojian. Pan Yanjun was one-sidedly making her own plans right now, as if all the good men in the world had to stand in line for her to pick as she chose. As if they would marry her just because she decided on them. Who knew where her confidence came from? There was a commotion at the entrance of Qingxi Hall. Senior servant Liu's joyful voice filtered in from the entrance, shocking Pan Yanjun back to reality. Senior servant Liu spoke from the bottom of her heart, "You've finally returned. The matriarch has been missing you dearly. She has been asking this old servant about you at least once a day. Hurry, come in, all of you." A steady and captivating voice sounded in response, "I've caused Momo to worry." It was such a pleasant voice, like the poignant sound of a zither tapping on one's heartstrings, causing a person's body to turn numb. Pan Yanjun quickly shifted her gaze towards the entrance of the parlor. There, she saw a man as handsome as the bright moon walking in with his hands clasped behind his back. His features seemed to be carefully sculpted. There was a cold air around him while his eyes were like frozen lakes with impenetrable depths. His thin lips were slightly pursed together, making him look fickle, yet irresistible. He looked handsome, tall and heroic. Dressed in an ordinary set of clothing as he was, he still gave off a noble aura. Compared to Xiao Bojian, this person in front of her seemed more cool, reserved and imposing. Her heart beat incessantly in her chest. Pan Nianjun broke out into a blush and stammered out shyly, Second cousin. One could tell whether a couple had a good relationship from their daily interactions. Based on how Sanlang was doting on his wife, she could tell that they were currently in the honeymoon phase. It seemed she had made the right choice when she had let Sanlang's wife go to the northern border. The young couple had truly opened their hearts to each other. Their current state was completely different from when they had just gotten married. At that time, they had only appeared harmonious on the surface and they had actually been divided at heart. Matriarch he kept looking at Chu Lian's flat abdomen. Judging by how affectionate the young couple was with each other, it seemed like it wouldn't be long before she would be able to hold her great-grandson. She made a mental note to ask Great Dr. Miao to have a look at Sanlang's wife on another day and to help prepare her body for pregnancy. Chapter 463, He Erlang grows up, 2, Matriarch he was full of smiles, stop kneeling and get up. Look at you two. Both of you have lost weight. Do eat more later. While Matriarch he was happily asking all sorts of questions and showing great concern towards He Changdi, it had become awkward for Pan Nianjun who was at one side. When Pan Nianjun had called out second cousin, she had drawn a glare from He Ying in response. She had also made a joke of herself in front of the maidservant that served her in Qingxi Hall. Luckily, the maidservant had managed to avoid laughing out loud by covering her mouth. She bent over slightly and whispered into Pan Nianzhen's ear, Miss Pan, that was third young master, not the second young master of our estate. Pan Nianzhen's entire body stiffened up and her face turned ashen. What? This was third cousin. So he was really third cousin, who was already married. Actually, Pan Nianjun had already started questioning He Changdi's identity when Chu Lian had followed behind him and he had held her hand disregarding other people's eyes. It was just that her heart was reluctant to believe in it. By the time the maidservant had explained his identity to her, it was already too late to make herself numb. So that remarkable gentleman who had just walked past her was really the married third cousin. While staying in the Jinggan estate, she had heard the servants gossip about third cousin's appearance. However, it was even more astonishing seeing him in person today. His looks could be compared to that top scholar she had seen at the Plum Pavilion in Prince Wei's estate. Moreover, the emperor had bestowed the title of Marquis on Yuan to third cousin after his great achievements at the northern border. Right now, the peerage of House Jinggan was merely that of a count. Third cousin's title was even one rank higher than her grandfather's. Pan Nianjun couldn't contain the glow in her eyes. She didn't dare to lift her head, but out of the corner of her eyes, she looked at Chu Lian with much more envy and resentment. Soon after He Changdi and Chu Lian had settled down into their seats, the maidservant waiting at the entrance of the parlor announced the arrival of second young master. The curtains wavered slightly at first before they were lifted by someone on the outside with great force. At the same time, a tall and burly young man walked in gallantly. He Erlang was dressed in a black official's robe. He had a sturdy figure and a dark complexion. He looked very similar to He Dalong, but his facial features were more refined and prominent. He gave off the impression of a very masculine young man. He Erlang's appearance didn't really fit the current aesthetics of the Great Wu dynasty. However, if he had lived in modern times, he would have been quite popular among girls. He looked exactly like a typical manly man. That was Chu Lian's opinion of He Erlang, but it didn't mean that Pan Nianjun had the same thoughts. She was shocked stiff once He Changju entered the parlor. In an instant, Pan Nianzhen's face turned deadly pale and she lowered her head in fright. She really hated boorish men like He Erlang. He looked no different than the shirtless laborers working on the docks. He Erlang looked like a classic example of a simple-minded person with all brawn and no brains. She lowered her head, pursed her lips pursed, and remained silent. Yet, he Erlang didn't even notice the sudden addition of a new cousin. He smiled and went up to pay respects to his grandmother. May grandmother remain healthy as always. Grandson gives a belated New Year greeting to grandmother. Matriarch he gave he Erlang a glare, a belated New Year. Don't you know what date it is? It's already 10 days into February. He Erlang rubbed the back of his head and laughed sheepishly as he was helped up by Matriarch he. Anger rose up in Matriarch he while looking at the cause of the thorn in her heart. You're not allowed to run off this year. I've heard that the Emperor intends to let you join the Imperial Guards. You had better seize this opportunity. Since you're in the capital now, let's also take care of your marriage as well this year. Just take a look around you. In this entire capital, are there any young masters around your age that are still single? Are you trying to make this old lady and your parents die of frustration? He Erlang normally hated it when the elders in the family mentioned marriage. Whenever the topic came up, he would lose his temper and patience. His next course of action was usually to avoid returning to the estate after that. However, his attitude had been completely reversed this time. He smiled and bent over at the waist to hold on to Matriarchy's arm. He looked like a big circus bear nodding and bowing to please people. Grandmother, I've made you worry in the past. This year, I'll listen to you and bring back a granddaughter-in-law for you. Chapter 464, Muxiang, 1. His words shocked Matriarch he. When had this brat become so sensible? The more she looked at it, the stranger it seemed. He Ying's eyes lit up after she heard He Erlang's words. She glanced at her daughter with clear intentions. Unfortunately, Pan Yinjin was still looking down in a daze and she didn't catch the look her mother had thrown her way. He Ying furrowed her brows slightly as she looked at her absent-minded daughter. Matriarch he hadn't expected He Erlang to have suddenly turned so amenable to her requests. Her mood was currently better than it had ever been for some time. She called for everyone to sit down. There were only a few of them and they were all family, so they didn't separate the men and women for dinner. Everyone gathered around a large round table to eat. Fermented rice wine had been specially prepared for the occasion so the women could drink freely without fear of becoming drunk. Although they were not separated by gender for dinner, their seating positions had been specially prepared. He Daolong was sat to the left of Matriarchy, while Countess Jingan was seated on her right. Chu Lian sat beside He Sanlang and Miss Pan was on her other side. He Erlang was seated across from Pan Yinjin. For the reunion dinner tonight, Matriarchy had specifically ordered the kitchen to prepare a table full of dishes. There were also several new dishes that Chu Lian had instructed Xian to make in the main kitchen. The table was laden with a magnificent feast. He Ying looked at the exquisite dishes in front of her, before turning to smile at Chu Lian, Sanlang's wife. I heard about Gillen Restaurant the moment I arrived at the capital. Everyone has been saying that the dishes at Gillen Restaurant are the best in the capital. When will I get the chance to try them sometime? Before Chu Lian could answer, He Ying pinched Pan Nianzhen's hand under the table. While Miss Pan was shocked, she quickly reacted and continued the conversation. Mother, what do you mean by going to Gillen Restaurant? Third cousin-in-law's Gillen Restaurant hasn't been reopened yet. Upon hearing her daughter's words, He Ying looked surprised and smiled sheepishly. Chu Lian swept a cool gaze over the two women beside her. Her expression didn't show any hint of change and she maintained a faint smile on her face. Thanks to He Ying and her daughter, Matriarch he was also reminded of Gillen Restaurant. The matriarch asked, Lianer, what's happened to Gillen Restaurant? Why hasn't it reopened yet? If it was only He Ying and her daughter asking about it, Chu Lian could simply smile and ignore them. However, now that the matriarch had personally spoken up, she couldn't continue pretending ignorance. Chu Lian replied in a serious manner, "Grandmother, I was planning to make some changes to the layout of Gillen restaurant at first, so I told Xian to close the restaurant before the new year. The servants probably didn't dare to do anything else without my approval, since I wasn't in the capital. Thus, the reopening has been delayed until now. Now that I'm back in the capital, I'll work on reopening the restaurant as soon as possible." Matriarch He dropped her line of questioning and nodded. She advised, "It's best if you can reopen it earlier. The old Duke of House Xing has already sent his servants over several times to ask about it." Chu Lian nodded. Actually, she knew that it was actually the matriarch who was pushing her to reopen the restaurant. If old Duke Xing really couldn't wait to eat those delicacies again, he wouldn't have sent people over to ask the matriarch. He would have come to look for her himself. He chonged, his thick brows wrinkled slightly as he listened to his grandmother's words from the side. The matriarch gave the order to start eating. Since it was a rare reunion, they disregarded the usual formalities and the whole family chatted while eating. Chapter 465, Muxiang, 2, He Sanlang spoke the least during dinner. He only gave some short replies whenever the matriarch asked him some questions. However, no one thought it was strange since he always kept a cold expression on his face. Senior servant Zhou and matriarch He's 2 personal maidservants had also set up a small table in the side room. 3 dishes and a small pot of rice wine were enough for the 3 of them. Senior servant Zhou noticed that Muxiang seemed preoccupied, so she asked, "What's wrong? Are you still feeling unwell from that cold you got a couple days ago?" Muxiang quickly shook her head, "Momo, I'm fine now." "If you're fine, then hurry and eat. These dishes are all your favorites. The matriarch specially told the cook in the main kitchen to make more for you." Muxiang stared at the appetizing dishes in front of her and scowled in her heart. She didn't like to eat these at all. Did these people really think that she was the former Muxiang? Seeing that Muxiang still looked weary, senior servant Zhou muttered grudgingly, "What's wrong with this girl? She's acting like she's been possessed." Muxiang snorted in her heart. That was exactly it. Why else would she be in this lowly body? Muxiang promptly stood up. Senior servant Zhou set down her chopsticks and frowned. "Girl, what's wrong with you?" Muxiang's eyes fell on the wall beside her. She suddenly lowered her head and innocently smiled at senior servant Zhou. "Momo, since I don't really have any appetite, why don't I go and serve the matriarch?" Senior servant Zhou thought that she was too dedicated to her work. She tried to persuade her otherwise. "Shang Yun and He Xiang are taking care of the matriarch. You don't have to worry. Momo, just let me go, please. I have nothing to do anyway. I just want to spend more time with the matriarch." Senior servant Zhou had no other choice but to let her go. She reprimanded with a smile on her face, "Just go then, you silly girl. I knew you were a restless one. Everyone else can't wait to rest more, but you just can't stop working throughout the day." Muxiang curtsied towards senior servant Zhou before she turned to walk to the parlor with a giggle. What senior servant Zhou didn't see was how Muxiang's expression instantly changed after she left the side room. The previously pure and sweet smile morphed into a contorted expression. Muxiang tightly clenched her fists. Her heart was beating fast in her chest as she couldn't hold back the mix of emotions surfacing on her face. It seemed like there was agitation, agony, as well as excitement and tension. In short, various emotions were all mixed up, causing her originally pretty face to warp into a monstrous grimace. Her complex emotions caused her steps to become disorderly. Even though she was trying to restrain it, there was still a voice screaming in her heart. A voice that was trying to break through all the heavy shackles imprisoning it. "He Changdi, I'm finally going to meet you again. This time, I won't make the wrong choice anymore. You're my husband. In all our lifetimes, you can only be my husband. Muxiang's whole body was shaking like a leaf as she stepped into the parlor. Not because she was scared, but due to her extreme excitement and elation. All the masters of the He family were busy with their dinner, so they didn't notice Muxiang entering cautiously with light steps. Muxiang slowly lifted her head and looked towards the table in the center of the parlor. The moment her gaze landed on He Changdi, she couldn't pull it away. It was him. It was really him. That was the face that was engraved into her memory. Now that she could finally see his face again, she realized that it hadn't changed at all. Muxiang tightly clenched her hands, using nearly all her strength to prevent herself from jumping right into He Changdi's arms. While in the middle of eating dinner, He Sanlang suddenly turned his gaze towards one corner with cold, probing eyes. Muxiang immediately withdrew her gaze and took on a respectful pose with her hands to her sides. When He Sanlang looked over, all he saw was a familiar-looking maidservant. He was slightly puzzled, but he didn't think much of it. He lowered his head and continued eating. At times, he would pick some food from the dishes that were far away from Chu Lian and place them in her bowl. TL note: I can't believe some of you actually guessed this plot twist. W. The element of surprise was going to be her biggest advantage. After living a whole lifetime, she had to be even more careful in this one and plot carefully to get what she wanted. She had enough patience and willpower to wait for her prey to fall into her trap, never to escape again. The corners of Muxiang's lips curled up and she sneered sinisterly. Unfortunately, there was one factor that was out of the careful Muxiang's expectations. He Changdi was no longer the bright, innocent, handsome young man of the past. He was a man who had undergone the trials and tribulations of his past life. His personality was vastly different from before. He Changdi and Chu Lian had only just returned to the capital after many days of travel, so matriarch He didn't keep the couple for too long. After they were done with dinner, she instructed them to return to their courtyard early to rest. The young couple then escorted Countess Jingan on the way out of Qingxi Hall. Since the main guests of the family banquet had left, there was no reason for the other family members to outstay their welcome. Chapter 467, The End of the Family Banquet, 2. It was He Erlang who bid his goodbyes first. Following that, He Dalong stood up with a flourish of his robes, bowed towards the matriarch, and left the parlor just like that. Madame Zhou bit her lip after watching He Dalong's burly silhouette disappear behind the curtains of the entrance. Finally, she let senior servant Xiao help her up and they left together. Only matriarch He Ying, and Miss Pan were left in the originally lively parlor. Matriarch He waved at her daughter in dismissal. It's getting late. Why don't you go to bed too? He Ying had been intending to stay back to discuss something with her mother. However, seeing the fatigue on her mother's face, she swallowed her words. She bobbed her goodbye together with her daughter, Pan Nianjun, and left. By the time He Changdi and Chu Lian left Countess Jingan's courtyard, it was already dark. There were lanterns hanging on either side of the path, lighting up the estate with a warm glow. Xian and the other servants followed behind the young couple. After experiencing what had happened earlier, Xian kept her eyes on the ground and walked slowly, lagging behind her masters until there was some distance between them. She had trained the younger maidservants behind her well enough that they understood her actions and followed exactly as she did. He Changdi held on to Chu Lian's soft little hand and walked in front of her. It was still February, so the night was a little cold. Chu Lian's hand was completely enveloped by He Changdi's. She held up the hem of her heavy dress with one hand and stumbled occasionally as she was tugged along by him. She wanted to pull her hand out from his hold, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't. He Changdi suddenly paused in his steps and glanced at her, his eyes a pair of bottomless wells. Chu Lian looked up and caught sight of his pressed lips before her hand was abruptly released. In the midst of her surprise, Sanlang had already bent down and grabbed hold of her slender waist with one arm while the other went under her knees. Following that, with a slight application of force, Chu Lian was now curled up in his arms in a bridal carry. Chu Lian let out a gasp in shock. When she finally regained her senses, she beat at his solid chest with a tiny fist, scolding him angrily. "He Changdi. What are you trying to do? Put me down now." Sanlang looked down at the woman in his arms and lowered his head to plant a quick kiss on her soft, fair cheek. His magnetic voice rumbled close to her ear with a warning. "Behave yourself." Chu Lian was extremely vexed, but she knew that hitting him was only going to make her hand hurt. In the few months that they had grown close together, Chu Lian had already gotten a handle on his strange temperament. Thus, she pleaded in a soft tone, "Husband, put me down and let me walk on my own. Xian and the others are right behind." When the two of them were alone, Chu Lian would rarely call him husband. Most of the time, she simply addressed him as Sanlang or Changdi. Hearing such a tender, loving call from his wife, especially when she was curled up in his arms, sent a bolt of electricity racing down Changdi's body. He stiffened up completely for a whole second. His deep gaze darkened even more until his eyes were like pools of ink, and his thin lips pressed into an even finer line as his strides quickened. All Chu Lian heard was his husky response. "Don't worry. It's night time now. They won't be able to see what they're not allowed to." When his breathing changed, Chu Lian finally realized what had happened. She wailed inwardly to herself. She hadn't used the right solution after all, she had just provoked the beast. Since she could feel the changes in his body, Chu Lian was in an absolute state of awkwardness. She kept a tight hold on the lapels of his shirt and gave up on trying to get him to set her down. Lying obediently in his arms, she tried negotiating instead. "Then could you put me down when we reach the corridor right before we enter our courtyard?" There were so many servants around Songtao Court. It would be so embarrassing if they spotted her like this. Changdi kept his expression cool as he struggled with himself in his mind. Finally, he nodded and agreed to her request. Actually, his wife's body was all nice and soft. She felt so comfortable in his embrace that he didn't want to put her down at all. He wanted to carry her all the way to the bed in their room. Chapter 468, Nightclothes, 1. It went without saying that Changdi absolutely wouldn't voice those thoughts to his wife. While trapped in his embrace, Chu Lian made a silent vow to never wear such an impractical dress again. It was beautiful to look at, but walking in it was just putting herself in trouble. Sanlang was a man of his word. He put Chu Lian down by the decorative mountain in front of the corridor. However, he didn't just walk off straight after. Instead, he helped her straighten out her disheveled clothes before taking her hand and walking to their room in Songtao Court together. When senior servant Gui caught sight of third young master holding third young madam's hand, she couldn't help but smile. The moment Changdi entered the parlor, he shot a signal at Wenqing, Wenlan, and senior servant Zhong with his eyes before pulling Chu Lian towards the bedroom. When senior servant Gui was about to enter the bedroom with Jingyan behind her to wait upon them, they were held back by senior servant Zhong. "Dear sister, there's something I need to discuss with you. Let's just have Wenqing stand guard here for today." Senior servant Gui glanced at the couple who had just disappeared past the curtains covering the entrance of the bedroom, then back at the smiling senior servant Zhong. Realization dawned upon her. She smacked herself on the forehead and admitted with some embarrassment, "Look at how muddle-headed I've gotten." Thus, the two senior servants sent away all the other nearby servants in tacit understanding, leaving only Xian and Wenqing in case third young master and madam called. Chu Lian's face began to heat up uncontrollably the moment she was pulled into the bedroom by Changdi. She had a sinking feeling that Sanlang wasn't going to let her off tonight. Thinking of the promise she had made to him back when he was still recovering from his wounds, Chu Lian was both shy and nervous. He Changdi had finally managed to get Chu Lian alone in the bedroom with him. There was no way he was going to remain restrained and reserved. At almost the exact moment the curtains fell behind them, Chu Lian was already wrapped tightly in his embrace. Chu Lian had a petite figure, so being bound by He Changdi's arms made her feel like she was being folded into his body. Her dainty cheek pressed against his chest. She could hear the strong and hurried thumps of his heart. The pace of his heartbeat seemed to be contagious as her heart also started to beat faster without her control. He Sanlang's large palms gently caressed her back, like he was reassuring a panicking kitten. He lowered his head and gently kissed her jet-black hair. In a deep voice, he asked, "Lianer, do you still remember what you promised me?" Chu Lian's breathing came to a halt and her grip on his shirt tightened. She gulped nervously before putting on a strong front and mumbling, "Dinner was rather salty tonight. Husband, I want some water." She had truly run out of ideas. Otherwise, Chu Lian wouldn't have used such a crappy excuse to change the subject. She shut her eyes, filled with such embarrassment that she didn't dare to check his reaction. She hadn't thought much of it when she had made the promise, as she thought that it was something that would be over with in the blink of an eye. However, now that it was actually time to fulfill her promise, she couldn't help but grow nervous and scared. It was Chu Lian's first time in both this life and her last. She had also heard that it would be painful. So, she had suddenly turned into a scaredy cat and would take every opportunity to delay her impending doom. Chu Lian believed that her words would anger the bipolar He Sanlang. However, who could have thought that, just a moment later, all she would hear was his deep, pleasant laugh from above. With her head on his chest, she could feel him shaking with laughter. Chu Lian's blush instantly deepened. This guy was actually laughing at her. She pushed He Sanlang away in equal parts shame and anger before raising her head to look at his expression. The moment she saw his smiling eyes, Chu Lian became even more annoyed. He was actually laughing at her. "You're not allowed to laugh." Chapter 470, Nuptial Wine. 1. Xian helped Chu Lian with wiping her hair dry and anointed her with some perfume before taking her leave. The room was extremely warm and comfy because of the heated floors. There were also several braziers placed around the room. Chu Lian didn't feel the slightest bit of chill even when she took off her cloak. She unfolded the blankets and dove into the bed. The warm and soft blanket covering her body made her sigh from comfort. With her entire body ensconced in warmth, the tension in Chu Lian quickly dissipated and she fell asleep. While in a half-dazed state, she felt someone pulling her into the crook of an arm. Due to her experience from before, Chu Lian hadn't fallen into a deep sleep, so this action startled her awake. The moment she opened her eyes, she was faced with He Changdi, whose eyes were as bright as stars in the night sky. Chu Lian turned mute with shock. It took her a moment to take a hold of herself and speak, "Why are you here?" At this point, He Changdi had already lifted up the blanket and made his way into the warm and cozy nest. He tightened his grip around her and stared calmly at her blushing face. He let out a gentle laugh. "Were you expecting me to sleep in the study instead of our bedroom?" Since he had just lifted up the blanket, it hadn't completely settled down to cover their bodies yet. The whole area from Chu Lian's neck to her chest was exposed to his gaze. The faint lantern light streaming through the curtains on the bed made her exposed snowy white skin look all the more appetizing. He Sanlang sized up the nightclothes she seemed to have worn intentionally with a smile. His voice dipped a few notches as he continued, "If I hadn't come, wouldn't you have worn this robe for nothing?" Chu Lian's mind was still hazy after getting woken up. However, his words made her recall that she was still wearing those extremely revealing nightclothes. Her cute little cheeks lit up in a furious blush instantly. Chu Lian hastily explained, "This was prepared by Momo. I didn't choose this, don't misunderstand." Senior servant Gui. Chu Lian quickly nodded. He Chang's eyes were already alight with humor, but he put on a dignified face and said, "Senior servant Gui is indeed an experienced senior servant, it's about time that I give her a raise." Once he finished speaking, He Changdi pulled away the blanket covering their body in one go. Shyness and anger welled up within Chu Lian. She hadn't expected such a sudden movement from him, and her whole body stiffened up in response. It was only when He Changdi looked all over her body with his gleaming eyes that she finally returned to her senses. Realizing that she had nothing to cover herself with, Chu Lian sat up in a panic and tried to cover He Sanlang's eyes with her hands instead. When she raised her slender arms, the two soft lumps under her clothes were squeezed together, forming a deep ravine that called out to the beholder. The Adam's apple on He Changdi's throat trembled as he gulped down his drool. Unfortunately, his eyes were immediately covered in the next second. Chu Lian's soft hands blocked He Changdi's invading gaze. Her face was completely flushed as she said furiously, "You're not allowed to look." He Changdi didn't know what to do right now. Wasn't his little kitten being too difficult? He was probably the most pitiful husband in the whole capital for getting scolded just for looking at his own wife. It left a bitter taste in his heart. Now that He Changdi's vision was obscured, Chu Lian felt safer. Little did she know that she was merely deceiving herself by delaying the inevitable. It was a rare sight for He Changdi to see her in such a helpless and shy state, so he didn't stop her and let her cover his eyes as she liked. Besides, her hands were so small and she was so tense that she hadn't noticed that her blindfold had already slipped and he could take in everything. He Changdi was laughing endlessly inside. His dear wife was just too cute. Chu Lian might have succeeded in blocking He Changdi's evil eyes, but she had no way to counter his evil claws. He Sanlang reached out to hook her around the waist again and pulled her soft and fragrant body on top of him with barely any effort at all. The bedroom was very warm, so He Sanlang wasn't worried about her feeling cold despite her thin clothes. Chu Lian could feel the burning heat of his hand on her waist. She struggled a little in an attempt to break free from his evil claws, but it was pointless as she was imprisoned in his embrace. Chapter 471, Nuptial Wine, 2. Her attempt at struggling made He Changdi stiffen up even more. The dangerous swelling from a certain part of He Sanlang's body made the huffed-up kitten on top of him quieten down. Chu Lian laid in He Sanlang's embrace stiffly, not daring to move at all. Her hands were still on his eyes. This position was extremely uncomfortable for her, but she felt too embarrassed to put down her hands. The hand that He Sanlang had wrapped around her waist was now rubbing her back in a soothing motion. He said with a chuckle, "Put down your hands." Chu Lian shook her head first before realizing that he couldn't see her action since his eyes were covered. She coughed awkwardly and attempted to start a negotiation. "I can put down my hands, but only if you let me change my clothes, okay?" He Changdi found this really funny. Even at this point, his little kitten was still trying to flee. He stopped being courteous and used his other hand to grab hold of her slender wrists. He easily pulled away both of her hands from his eyes. Chu Lian hadn't expected him to resort to brute force, so she tried to struggle subconsciously. However, He Changdi reacted by chiding her in a cold manner. "Stop moving." He Sanlang had always possessed a naturally chilly temperament. After spending a few months with the Northern Army and experiencing real fights on the battlefield, his aura had been forged into one of blood and steel. When he reprimanded someone now, the air around him was truly frightening. Chu Lian was also shocked still by him. Now that the woman on his chest had stopped struggling, He Changdi was able to take a good look at her. He continued to caress her back as he turned around, picked up a gold cup from the side table and passed it to Chu Lian. When Chu Lian returned to her senses, she had already accepted the golden cup that He Changdi had passed to her. She looked down at the contents of the cup before bringing it closer and sniffing at it. She tilted her head in confusion and asked, "This is wine." He Changdi reached out to the side again to pick up an identical cup. He tapped it against the one in Chu Lian's hand with a light clink before nodding. With an averted gaze and a light tone, he explained, "Nuptial wine." Despite how soft his voice had become, Chu Lian heard him clearly. Nuptial wine. Her mind flew back to their wedding night. Back then, He Changdi had poured away the nuptial wine prepared by the bridal attendant right in front of her, throwing her into a state of stunned shock. Was he trying to make up for what happened then by offering her nuptial wine now? Noticing that the kitten on his chest hadn't lifted up the cup to her lips, He Sanlang's expression became a little more awkward. He adjusted his posture and coughed once. He humbled his tone to ask, "Lianer, what happened back then was my mistake. I shouldn't have poured away the nuptial wine. Will you let me make up for that today?" Chu Lian rolled her eyes at him. Making up for that? Had this guy ever thought of how horrified and disappointed he had made her when he had gone insane then? She didn't really feel like forgiving him, but when she thought of the time they had spent together and how he had saved her without any regard for his own safety, she couldn't bear to do that to him. He Changdi wasn't made of steel after all. He couldn't bear watching as his wife refused to forgive him. Panic arose in him as he stared fixedly at the nuptial wine in their hands. He recalled the instructions of the bridal attendant on their wedding night. They had to drink half from each cup of nuptial wine for their marriage to last forever. Thus, Chu Lian was met with the spectacle of the frosty He Sanlang emptying the wine in his cup into his mouth. However, it seemed like that wasn't enough for him. He grabbed her wrist and poured the contents of her cup into his mouth as well. Chu Lian. Had this fellow's mind snapped from her lengthy silence? The moment the strange thought appeared in Chu Lian's mind, she was pulled back into He Sanlang's embrace. She felt a slight chill on her lips before warm wine flowed into her mouth. A forceful tongue slid in as well, forcing her to swallow all of the spicy alcohol. Chapter 472, Conjugal Love, 1. Once all of the wine had slid down her throat, he twined their tongues together in a dance until Chu Lian was gasping for breath. It was only when her hands tightened around the lapels of He Changdi's sleep robe that he finally let her go. Chu Lian's face was completely red and she didn't even know whether it was from the heat of the alcohol or He Changdi's passionate kiss. She gulped air down into her burning lungs and glared at her husband in complaint. However, her almond-shaped eyes were misted over with tears now, shining with the reflection of the lantern light and looking especially innocent. That lovely sight was pushing the last remnants of He Changdi's control. He took in a deep breath himself, as if trying to calm the rising tides in his body. He Changdi's gaze fixed upon the woman before him as his pupils dilated. He shifted his body, preparing to start another passionate kiss. Chu Lian's heart was about to leap out of her chest from how nervous she was. She quickly raised her hands to stop him. She complained pitifully, "He Changdi, it's all your fault. My mouth is filled with the taste of alcohol now. I don't like it. Can you let me up to rinse it out?" When He Sanlang's only response was to continue staring at her with sealed lips, Chu Lian couldn't help the twitch at the corner of her mouth. Her watery eyes darted from side to side in thought before she moved her body back. She tried putting on an eagerly attentive tone, "Husband, I saw that you didn't eat much earlier. Why don't we order some supper? Shein mentioned that she made some red date and bird's nest porridge and she's keeping it warm on the stove. I'm a little hungry now too." He Changdi finally spoke up in a husky voice, the tail end of his sentence rising with implication, "Lianer, are you worried that I won't have enough strength later tonight?" Chu Lian stiffened up in surprise. It took her a second before she realized what he meant. Her face exploded into a furious blush once again. She hadn't expected that this gloomy fellow would turn into such a perverted scoundrel in front of her. Chu Lien stammered, not even daring to look at him now. Not at all. Is there anything else you'd like to say now, Lianer? Just say it all at once. You probably won't be able to speak later. He Changdi purposely emphasized his words again to hint at what was coming up, causing the blush on Chu Lien's cheeks to glow even brighter. Chu Lien was looking everywhere except at He Changdi right now. Since they had both drunk the nuptial wine, there was a light scent of alcohol on their breaths. An idea sparked in Chu Lien's mind and she quickly said, "We just ate at grandmother's place and we just drank some wine. You probably haven't taken a bath yet, right? I'll go and ask Wenqing and the rest to prepare the bath." After blurting all of that out, she tried to climb off the bed. However, He Sanlang's leg was in her way. Of course he wouldn't be letting her off so easily. Chu Lien huffed as she shoved his leg away with all her might. She had just managed to take a step forward on the soft carpet at the bottom of the bed when He Changdi grabbed hold of her slender waist yet again without any effort. The nightclothes Chu Lien was wearing were simply too see-through. Her curves were completely visible under the mint-colored robe that fell down to their ankles. He could see the loose pink pants and light green top she had underneath. Even the shiny strap of her halter top underwear was visible in the dim light. He Changdi's pupils dilated. With a slight pull of his arm, Chu Lien was already back in bed. He leaned over her as his wandering palm caressed the soft skin around her waist. Squished under her husband, Chu Lien didn't have the energy to think about her seductive nightwear any longer. She stared up at him innocently with her wide, watery eyes, looking exactly like a little rabbit waiting to be eaten. "You really aren't going to bathe?" The soft and gentle tones of Chu Lien's voice made He Changdi stiffen up even more. He reached out with one hand to stroke her smooth, porcelain cheeks. With a puff of breath by her ear, he spoke huskily, "I bathed when I came back to the estate earlier. There's no need to waste any more time." Chapter 473, Conjugal Love, 2. Once he finished speaking, Chu Lien could feel some wetness on her sensitive earlobes as he sucked on them. Chu Lien tried to push him away and tried to retort in her urgency, "But it's already been a whole afternoon and we just drank wine." He Changdi couldn't let her off any longer now that they were already here. Chu Lien was his lawfully wedded wife after all. This was supposed to have happened a long time ago. Since they were in mutual love now, he had done pretty well to restrain himself up to this point. Before Chu Liuan could finish her words, He Changdi grabbed the tip of her chin. His dark eyes were slightly narrowed as they roamed all over her body, like a conqueror looking over his territory. He Changdi's gaze passed over her ruddy red lips, then down to her slightly open collar, then her inviting collarbones. He abruptly bent down and captured her parted, tender lips. Once he had the first taste, he could no longer hold back his desire to lick and explore her mouth. Chu Lien panted for breath, her cheeks flushed red again, as she hit his sturdy chest in protest. Unfortunately, He Changdi easily caught her hands and trapped them between their bodies so that she couldn't move. When He Sanlang felt that the woman under him had already given in, he pushed past her teeth with his tongue and tangled with hers. The smell of alcohol mixed with the aroma of the incense burning in the room made Chu Lien's mind dazed. Her husband had trapped her so utterly within his hold that she couldn't bring up any strength to struggle, even if she still wanted to. As if sensing Chu Lien's remaining reluctance, He Sanlang tightened his hold around her wrists. Chu Lien's waist finally relaxed, indicating that she had completely given in. Chu Lien wanted to cry inside as she thought to herself dejectedly. It looked like she wouldn't be able to escape tonight. Why was He Changdi so overbearing? He Changdi loosened his hold a little once he felt that his wife had stopped trying to escape. He let go of her lips, allowing her to gulp in air once again. Following that, he littered gentle kisses on her lips and played with her tongue. The hand he was using to hold her chin slowly moved downwards. By this time, Changdi's cold countenance had already taken on a tinge of red. His eyes were like dark mirrors, the only image reflected in them was his absolutely lovely wife. He lowered his gaze and stopped his kisses, only to switch to licking her trembling tongue. Chu Lian felt a sudden chill on her shoulders and realized that Changdi had already slipped her thin nightclothes off. She subconsciously tried to cover herself up again by sitting up and pulling forcefully at the blanket nearby, but Sanlang took that chance to catch the thin cloth ties on her back and pull them loose. By the time Chu Lian had grabbed hold of the edge of the blanket, all she had left on her was that thin pair of sleeping pants. Her eyelashes trembled as she looked up in alarm. Changdi had never been so forward with her before. Unfortunately for her, she had only grasped a tiny bit of the blanket and the rest of it was still trapped under Sanlang's legs. She couldn't move it with the power contained in her slender arms. The pitiful amount of blanket she had was only able to cover her upper half, leaving her lower half exposed. Sanlang's usual calm and cool expression had already crumbled into a light blush. As he admired how the red hue of the mandarin duck blanket complemented his lovely wife's fair skin, his breathing got a little heavier. Chu Lian didn't have any fight left in her by now. She held onto the corner of the blanket to protect what was left of her modesty as she tried to appeal to her husband with a pitiful expression and a soft voice, "Husband, please let me off for tonight." Chapter 474, Husband and Wife, 1. Changdi watched as she clung tightly to the corner of the blanket, which was only covering the most important spot on her body. Everything else was practically bared to his gaze. The faint lamplight filtering through the gauzy bed curtains gave her fair skin a lovely glow, enticing him. Chu Lian was like a lamb placed on the table for slaughter. The sight soothed Changdi's sense of urgency. He raised his body slightly and stripped off his top. He asked her with a trace of humor, "How would you like me to spare you, Lianer?" Chu Lian stared back in a daze. That's right, how exactly did she want him to spare her? They were husband and wife already. This was something inevitable. However, his hurried actions had made her a little afraid and uneasy. Chu Lian continued holding on to the corner of the blanket as she asked him in a soft and coaxing manner, "How about doing this another day, husband? We've just returned to the capital today and you even went to the palace, so you must be tired. Why don't we postpone this to tomorrow? It's already late, let's rest for the night." Sanlang held back the urge to burst into laughter. His little kitten was actually trying to escape even at this point. He casually tossed his inner clothes to the floor, revealing the fine lines of his body and his well-defined abs to Chu Lian's eyes. Changdi wasn't going to let her avoid him forever. He pulled away the blanket in his eyes and whispered huskily into her ear, "All right, I'll listen to you. Well, rest early." Chu Lian barely had the time to let out a surprised gasp when Sanlang pounced on her. Within a few minutes, the couple was intertwined like a pair of mandarin ducks and the sounds of lovemaking resounded in the room. Unfortunately, as bold and strong as Sanlang was, he was still a virgin. The couple's first time together was over in less than 15 minutes. Chu Lian's face was completely flushed red. Her pleading had landed on deaf ears, so in a last show of temper, she pulled over the blanket and bit onto it, resisting the foreign waves of pleasure rushing over her body. Her mind was completely hazy and dazed. She wailed inwardly, not knowing how long the torture would last. Her body felt like jelly all over and she was on the verge of giving in. It was Chu Lian's first time, so she didn't get to enjoy much of the pleasure of this conjugal activity. On the other hand, Sanlang had already become an addict. Just as Chu Lian was wondering when this would end, she felt a strange sensation in the lower half of her body. Her strong husband froze up and the stiff object inside her softened. Neither of them had expected their first time to be over so quickly. Chu Lian slowly opened her eyes, only to be met with a black-faced Enchanting. Chu Lian quickly used up all of her restraint to hold back the urge to laugh. Luckily, she succeeded in her efforts. Otherwise, her lunatic husband might have taken that as a challenge to make her bedridden the next day. Since it was already over, Chu Lian bore with the soreness in her body and reached out with her wobbly arms to push him. She blinked innocently and spoke in a slightly hoarse voice, "He Sanlang, I'm feeling too sore so I'm going to take a bath." He Sanlang was still immersed in the shock from the blow of finishing so quickly. Thanks to his momentary lapse, Chu Lian was able to make her escape. Chu Lian quickly scrambled off the bed, bearing with the soreness between her legs. She grabbed the nightclothes by the side of the bed and pulled the robe over her body before running towards the bathroom. Although she was stumbling a little, she finally made it. Chu Lian rang the bell to summon Wenqing in. Wenqing entered from the servants' entrance, her head lowered as she waited obediently for third young madam's orders. Chapter 475, Husband and Wife, 2. Chu Lian's strength had already been completely sapped by the activities just now, so she leaned against the screen and told Wenqing to prepare a hot bath. When that was done, Chu Lian entered the fragrant, steaming bath and let out a comfortable sigh of relief. Strength was slowly returning to her limbs. When she recalled what she had just done with Enchanting in bed, a furious blush flared back to life on her cheeks. She covered her burning cheeks with her hands and soaked in the bath in an absent-minded daze until the sound of footsteps resounded behind her. The moment she turned around, she was met with the gloomy-looking He Sanlang. Her husband stripped off his sleeping robe and tossed it haphazardly to one side before stepping right into the bathtub. She didn't have any time to react before Enchanting was already in the bath with her. With another pull of his long arms, she was already wrapped in his naked embrace. Chu Lian's eyes widened in shock. It took her a moment to find her voice again. "Enchanting, what are you doing? Get out." The usual cold layer of frost had returned to He Sanlang's handsome face. He scooped up some warm water and poured it over Chu Lian's smooth shoulders before suddenly bending over to nibble her earlobe. His deep and hoarse voice echoed in the bathroom, "What am I doing? I'm just taking a bath." Chu Lian saw that his hands were starting to wander, so she started struggling. The level of water in the bath dwindled as water splashed all over the bathroom. In the end, they weren't able to finish their bath as half of the water in the tub had spilled over. Chu Lian let out a shrill cry as she was carried back to their bed by Enchanting. He Sanlang seemed to be trying to prove himself to her as he entered her continuously, ignoring Chu Lian's pleas for mercy. At last, he managed to last longer than their first hurried coupling. Near the end, Chu Lian didn't even have the strength to lift a finger any longer. The moment Enchanting had finished, she dozed right off into sleep from fatigue. Enchanting was covered in beads of sweat all over, but his mood was the highest it had ever been. He pulled out and went off to the bathroom to clean himself. When he was done, he found a handkerchief and dipped it in warm water to clean Chu Lian's body. When he finished cleaning his wife and realized that red marks had been left all over her snow-white skin from his excessive use of force, guilt rose within him and he started feeling vexed with himself. He helped Chu Lian into a clean set of nightclothes and gently fed her a few spoonfuls of the warm honey water on the side table. Finally, he changed the bed sheets before carefully setting her back down on the bed and snuggling right in with her, gaze fixed on her defenseless sleeping expression. Outside, in the servants' wing, Xian was feeling sorry for her mistress. She knew that Chu Lian hadn't consummated her marriage with Enchanting on their wedding night and that this was the couple's first time together. Even at the start, when there hadn't been much movement from the bedroom, she had still been extremely worried. Later on, after Wenqing had gone in to prepare a hot bath, the sounds and movements coming from inside the bedroom were even louder than before. She could even hear her young madam's soft cries. Chu Lian had never cried in front of her servants before. Xian was frantic with worry, afraid that third young master was abusing her mistress. She had listened to the gossiping senior servants in the past when she had been bored. The servants had talked about how there was a servant being abused by her husband, who took out the stresses of his job on her and beat her until she cried for mercy. The more she thought about it, the more worried she got until she couldn't take it any longer. Xian abruptly stood up and spoke, "I have to go in to check on third young madam. I won't let anyone bully third young madam, even if it's third young master." Wenqing was alarmed by Xian's declaration. How could she really let Xian enter the bedroom? If the two of them entered the bedroom at this time, their lives would likely be forfeit. She practiced martial arts, so her hearing was more acute than Xian's. Furthermore, senior servant Zhong had specially educated them on the birds and the bees, so she was much more knowledgeable than Xian on these matters. It wasn't easy for her to explain it so openly. However, she understood that it was always hard for women on their first time. Although she felt for third young madam as well, she was more afraid of third young master. They were just servants, so it was better if they didn't interfere with their master's activities. Chapter 476, Early Morning, 1. Wenqing held Xian's arm and shook her head. She whispered, "Sister Xian, you don't have to worry so much. Third young master usually dotes on third young madam, why would he bully her? As servants, we shouldn't interfere with our master's business. Moreover, third young madam didn't call for us. We can't just go in like that. Also, think about third young madam's personality. If she was really being bullied, wouldn't she call for help?" Although Xian was still worried, Wenqing ultimately convinced her. After their masters had returned to Songtao Court, they were able to see for themselves how much third young master cared for third young madam. Also, third young madam was someone who would definitely return an eye for an eye. If she really suffered any grievance, she wouldn't endure it silently. The two personal maidservants stayed up until midnight. Xian finally breathed a sigh of relief when they could no longer hear any movement within the room. Wenqing finally relaxed as well, her face flushed. Since their masters had settled down for the night, they didn't need two servants to stay up for the night shift. In the end, Wenqing told Xian to take a rest and leave her to keep watch through the night in the side room by herself. After leaving the room, Xian didn't immediately go back to her room to rest. She headed to senior servant Gui's room first to report that the young couple had finally consummated their marriage. Senior servant Gui was still awake, waiting for Xian's report. After receiving the news, senior servant Gui clasped her hands together and bowed in prayer. A smile appeared on her face. She pushed Xian and said, "Well, I can rest assured now. If third young madam gives birth to a son in the future, I'll be able to enjoy my old age in peace. It's getting late now. You should hurry and go sleep." Xian watched as senior servant Gui got up from bed instead and started getting dressed. She asked curiously, "Momo, why are you getting up when it's already this late?" Senior servant Gui grinned so widely that her eyes disappeared. "Sixth miss has a thin and weak body. This first night must have been tough for her. I'm going to brew some nourishing soup, so she can drink some first thing in the morning." Seeing how excited senior servant Gui was, Xian didn't stop her. "Momo, do rest earlier when you're done. I'll go back to my room first." Xian and Fuyan lived in the same room. When Xian returned to her room, she saw that the room was still lit. Her brows creased into a frown and she muttered to herself, "It's already so late. Why hasn't Fuyan slept yet? What's that girl doing at this hour?" She quickly walked towards the door and tried pushing it open, only to find out that someone had actually locked it from the inside. Chu Lian's personal maidservants all lived together in a small courtyard within Songtao Court. They usually took turns to be on standby with their masters at night, so the courtyard entrance and the room doors were never locked. There was also a senior servant guarding the courtyard entrance at night. It was even more strictly guarded outside, so nothing had ever happened before. A trace of suspicion was aroused in Xian's heart. She called out softly to Fuyan from outside the door. Fuyan suffered a fright when she heard the door being pushed. She had been expecting Xian to be on duty until morning since she was taking the night shift. Who could have thought that Xian would return to their room at this time? She panicked and hid the letter she had been clutching in her hands under her pillow. She straightened out her dress and calmed her breathing before opening the door as if nothing had happened. When the door opened from the inside, Xian immediately entered the room, only to see that Fuyan hadn't even changed her clothes. It was obvious that she hasn't slept yet, so she asked, "It's so late, why aren't you resting? It's your turn to serve third young madam tomorrow." Fuyan went over to the bed and sat down. She picked up the sewing basket next to her and said, "I wanted to finish sewing the flower on this handkerchief before going to sleep. I didn't realize that time flew by so quickly. So it's already midnight." Xian furrowed her brows. "There's no need to stay up so late. You can work on the handkerchief anytime. Alright, go to sleep now. If something goes wrong tomorrow, Momo won't spare you." I'll listen to Sister Xian. I'll pack my things up and sleep now. It won't happen again. Chapter 477, Early Morning, 2. Xian looked at Fuyan from the corner of her eyes as she changed her clothes. She felt that Fuyan was acting rather strange tonight, but she hadn't been able to find out anything after questioning her. In the end, she decided to let it go. The light in the room was quickly snuffed out. Fuyan reached for the letter under her pillow in the dark, her eyes wavering. Finally, she gritted her teeth and made her decision. Chu Lian slowly opened her eyes. Her mind was still in a haze since she had just woken up. However, once she moved, her whole body began to ache and she almost cried out loud. Memories from last night suddenly rushed into her mind like a tidal wave. Chu Lian was stunned by her recollections for a moment before annoyance and anger overtook her mind. That he Sanlang. Last night, he had actually ignored her wishes and tortured her like that. Chu Lian turned over and noticed that he Changdi wasn't there. She reached out to touch the bed sheets beside her and realized that the area where he had been lying was already cold. She wrinkled her brows and prepared to call for a servant to come in. Wenqing heard the slight movement from outside and quietly entered the bedroom. She stood beside the bed, where the curtains had been let down, shielding Chu Lian from her gaze. She asked in a soft tone, "Third young madam, do you need this servant's assistance?" Chu Lian hadn't expected Wenqing to be waiting outside. Blood instantly rushed into her cheeks. She gave an awkward cough before asking in her slightly hoarse voice, "What time is it? Where's third young master?" Although he Changdi had been bestowed the title of Marquis on Yuan and an official position, he hadn't split off from the family yet. Their elders, Matriarch He, Countess Jingan, and eldest young madam, were also present in the estate, so everyone in the Jingan estate still called him third young master. Thus, Chu Lian was still third young madam. Wenqing smiled and replied, "Third young madam, please don't worry. It's only around 7 in the morning. Third young master went to the martial arts arena an hour ago." It was February right now, so it was still chilly in the capital. Although the bedroom was heated, it was much more comfortable to stay in bed. Since it was still early, Chu Lian couldn't be bothered to wake up. She hadn't gotten a good rest anyways. She spoke to Wenqing briefly before turning right around and going back to sleep. Wenqing smiled and tiptoed back out of the room. Third young madam had probably been tired out last night. Before third young master had gone to the martial arts arena, he had instructed her to let third young madam sleep more. Even if third young madam wanted to get up, she would have had to persuade her otherwise. Changdi came back about half an hour later. Wenqing and Wenlan, who were now on duty in the outer room, handed him a wet towel. Sanlang's gaze swept over them. Is your young madam awake? The corners of Wenqing's lips were still tilted upwards with humor. She woke up once half an hour ago and asked after third young master. Then she went back to sleep. Changdi's stern and icy face softened a little. He handed back the towel in his hand before striding into the bedroom with his hands clasped behind him. It was just a little over an hour since he had last seen her, but he was already starting to miss her terribly. He wanted to see that lovely, sweet face of hers immediately. Chu Lian was still deep in slumber when she felt something ticklish on her nose. She impatiently reached out with one hand, wanting to brush it off. Her slender wrist emerged from the loose sleeve of her nightgown. The little strength that she used was nothing to Sanlang. There were a few obvious red spots on her pale wrist, which looked strangely similar to the marks on her neck. The light in Changdi's deep eyes darkened. He held her fair arm and started dropping light kisses over the marks on her arm. Next, he gently tucked her arm back into the warm blankets. He took off his shoes and shifted closer to Chu Lian before pulling her into his embrace, blanket and all. That action finally woke Chu Lian up. She opened up her almond-shaped eyes, looking slightly dazed with a lovely blush on her face. Chapter 478, Early Morning, 2. The moment she opened her eyes, it was Changdi who fell into her sight. By the time she was able to overcome that short instant of confusion, Sanlang had already tried placing a gentle kiss on her soft lips. Chu Lian immediately reacted by turning her head to avoid it. Her temper peaked. She said, Changdi, you lied to me last night. Her whole body was wrapped up in the blanket within his embrace. She couldn't move at all. At this moment, she could only move her lips. Changdi couldn't hold back his chuckles when he saw her flushed face. When did I ever lie? When Chu Lian recalled his shameless and insatiable demands from last night, she gnashed her teeth in frustration. However, she had already experienced for herself how well he could twist his words. Moreover, they were lying together on the bed right now and her whole body was still aching. She couldn't afford to provoke him. Chu Lian pouted and turned her head away. She didn't want to answer his question. Sanlang stared at her reddened earlobe for a moment. He lowered his head to suck on it, his warm breath puffing over Chu Lian's ear as he whispered huskily, "It was my bad last night. Does it still hurt?" The blush on Chu Lian's ears extended to her entire face after hearing his question, especially since they were in such an intimate pose. She pursed her lips together and remained silent. It was too embarrassing to talk about this. Moreover, Changdi wasn't a doctor. He wouldn't be able to help even if she told him that it was hurting. When Sanlang saw that his wife was evading his gaze with a bashful look, he could guess what her answer would have been. Sanlang was worried about her, so he suggested, "Don't go over to visit grandmother and mother this morning. I'll send someone to let them know." Chu Lian's eyes widened and she immediately shook her head upon hearing his suggestion. "You can't. She had been completely fine and healthy yesterday. If she didn't visit her elders today for the usual morning greetings, what would everyone else think?" Chu Lian didn't want to discuss this topic with him any longer. She shifted her position and looked at the handsome man beside her. She brought up her own question, "You went out to exercise in the morning?" A spark of discomfort flashed through Changdi's deep eyes, but he quickly recovered his usual calm. He squeezed the lovely woman in his embrace. It's an old habit I've had even before I went to the north." When I joined the northern border troops later, Uncle Chien was really strict, so the time I spent on training became even longer. He Sanlang didn't dare to speak the truth. Actually, after consummating their marriage, he had been too excited to fall to asleep last night. He held her in his arms and just stared at her all night and only managed to nap for about 3 hours. When he had woken up, it was still dark outside. Chu Lian had been sleeping on his chest with her rosy cheeks, fair skin, and bright red lips. Moreover, her nightclothes had gotten a little disheveled in her sleep. A man's lust was the strongest in the morning. He Sanlang was also at the age when his body was full of vigor. With his beloved wife sleeping in his arms, it was unbearable. However, afraid of hurting Chu Lian, he Sanlang pursed his lips with a grim expression and headed out to the martial arts arena to vent. Ahem. He also paid a visit to Great Dr. Miao on the way. Chu Lian nodded without noticing the hidden meaning in He Changdi's eyes. She wriggled a little and complained, He Changdi, let go of me. It's getting late. I need to get up. While Chu Lian was struggling, He Changdi suddenly bent down and whispered something into her ear. Chu Lian instantly froze, the healthy blush on her face instantly fading to a pale pallor. She seriously wanted to strangle He Changdi right now. You actually went to look for Great Dr. Miao. Chapter 479, Early Morning. 4. He Sanlang had a cold expression on his face, but his voice was hoarse. Be good. I'll accompany you to Greek grandmother after you apply the medicine. Ahem. He had done a careful inspection while cleaning her up last night. That area was red and swollen because he had been too reckless. Chu Lian wailed and covered her head with the blanket. She felt too ashamed to face anyone else right now. About 20 minutes later, Chu Lian was still curled up in the blanket, covering her flushed face. She slowly calmed down as she listened to the sound of water coming from the bathroom. He Sanlang had actually ignored her opposition and personally applied the medicine for her. It served him right that he had to take a cold bath. Chu Lian thought angrily. Afterwards, she called Wenlan and Fuyin in to help her. Chu Lian was still feeling somewhat uncomfortable, so she walked about awkwardly when she got off the bed. It took a few rounds around the bedroom before she got used to the strange new feeling. Wenlan was keeping a happy smile hidden with her head lowered, but the look in Fuyin's downcast eyes were filled with envy and jealousy. When He Changdi came out of the bathroom wearing a loose robe, before Wenlan could walk up to him, Fuyin had already beaten her to it and handed him the dry towel in her hand. She attempted to reach out and help him dry his dark hair, but He Sanlang cast a cold gaze over the two maidservants. Wenlan immediately bobbed towards her two masters and turned to leave. When she noticed that Fuyin was still standing there in a daze, she grabbed Fuyin's hand and dragged her out before third young master got angry. When they got to the outer room, Fuyin angrily flung off Wenlan's hand and scolded her. Wenlan, what are you doing? Wenlan took a deep breath and glared at Fuyin. Fuyin, can't you tell? Third young master doesn't like us staying in there. Fuyin snorted, you're just being overly cautious. Third young master didn't even say anything. Wenlan's brows furrowed even more when she heard her reply, Fuyin, I'm going to give you some advice. Even if you came as part of third young madam's dowry, you still need to know your place. Remember Mingyan. Wenlan turned and left the outer room after leaving her warning. She was starting to dislike Fuyin even more. Did Fuyin really think third young madam was an idiot? Although third young madam was usually very kind and friendly and didn't like to make a fuss over small matters, that didn't mean that she was a naive person who would be easily fooled. Even if they didn't have a third young madam, did Fuyin seriously think that third young master was someone she could afford to provoke? Fuyin hadn't gone to the northern border with them, so she hadn't seen how many people third young master had killed on the battlefields. Otherwise, she wouldn't have these presumptuous thoughts. Fu Yan couldn't care less about Wenlun's warning. Chapter 480. To manage the household. 1. Although the emperor had already verbally appointed He Changdi as an administrator of the Department of Appointments, he hadn't taken up the post officially yet as he had just returned to the capital not too long ago. He would have to go to the imperial court to receive the role through an official ceremony eventually. After he and the other accomplished officers from the north had returned to the capital, they had all been granted half a month of leave after their meeting with the emperor. During this period, He Sanlang planned to spend more quality time with his family. The couple continued whispering sweet nothings to each other in the bedroom. Once they had their breakfast, it was time for them to pay their respects to their elders. The two first visited Qingxi Hall, before going over to Countess Jingan's courtyard. Countess Jingan was leaning slightly skewed against the headboard of a bed with a thick quilt covering her body. She seemed to be in great spirits, perhaps thanks to He Changdi's safe return from the north and the news of his great accomplishments. Her previously thin and pale face had now gained a little more color, making her seem more lively. He Changdi and Chu Lian went to visit Great Dr. Miao together and heard from him that Countess Jingan's condition was taking a turn for the better. He was preparing to use the Snow Mountain Mist's flower in a few more days to make some medicine to permanently cure the root of Countess Jingan's illness. The young couple was seated by Countess Jingan's bed. Countess Jingan held Chu Lian's hand as she chatted with them. In the middle of their conversation, Countess Jingan said with a smile, "Lianer, I've missed your cooking while you were away." A slight smile surfaced on Chu Lian's face. "What would you like to eat, mother?" "As long as it's good for your health, I'll make it right away." Before she had departed for the north, Chu Lian had regularly sent portions of food to the other courtyards whenever she cooked up something new in Songtao Court. She assumed that Countess Jingan had become accustomed to her cooking. Countess Jingan looked to be in serious thought for a moment. "The candied kumquats I ate the last time were very good, but kumquats are hard to find right now. Would you be able to use hawthorns instead?" Chu Lian nodded with a smile. "Yes, hawthorns are fine too. I'll make them myself and send them over to you myself when I'm done, mother." Countess Jingan chatted with the two for some time before letting them leave. They left the bedroom and headed out to the parlor, but the moment they had just stepped out of the parlor, Chu Lian's footsteps came to a halt. He Changdi found it strange, so he followed the direction of her gaze and looked towards the corridor on the right. They watched as a pregnant woman with a protruding belly walked towards them while being supported by two servants. The pregnant woman seemed pretty young. She was wearing a loose apple-red robe with a matching brocade cloak. Her hair was shaped into a simple bun, with just an ordinary golden hairpin holding it up. Although her face had become chubbier, Chu Lian was still able to recognize her instantly. She was Countess Jingan's personal maidservant, Miaozhen. Chu Lian hadn't expected Miaozhen's belly to have grown so quickly in the few months that she had been away. When Chu Lian thought of her eldest brother-in-law He Changdi, she felt sorry for him. He Changdi and Chu Lian were standing in a rather secluded area. They were basically in a blind spot from where Miaozhen was right now. Just as Chu Lian and He Changdi were about to leave, they heard conversation coming from Miaozhen's direction. One of the maidservants supporting Miaozhen asked, "Sister Miaozhen, are you feeling any discomfort today?" Miaozhen smiled and replied, "Not at all, I'm feeling good." The servant then asked, "Sister Miaozhen, are you still craving sour foods?" This time, Miaozhen didn't reply and shyly nodded instead. The servant gave a wide smile. "Sister Miaozhen, my mother said that craving for sour food means that it's a boy and craving for spicy food means that it's a girl. The child in your belly is definitely a little young master." The servant then paused for a moment as if she was afraid that someone might be eavesdropping. She intentionally moved closer to Miaozhen's ear and lowered her voice. "Our house doesn't have a little young master yet. If Sister Miaozhen gives birth to a boy, your position will be stable." She had kept her voice quiet, but Chu Lian was still able to hear every word she said. The brows on Chu Lian's little face furrowed together. Happiness was written all over Maya's hen's face at the thought, while the servant supporting her giggled out loud. While Chu Lian was staring blankly at them, He Changdi grabbed her hand. It was still cold in February, so this sent warmth to her icy cold hand. He Sanlang's handsome face reverted back to the grim expression that he put on in front of others. He then stooped over and whispered into Chu Lian's ear, "Let's go." Chu Lian stopped looking in Maya's hen's direction and gave a slight nod in response. After getting her agreement, He Changdi quickly pulled her away. Wen Lan and the other servants tactfully kept a distance while still following behind their masters. It was only when Chu Lian and He Changdi had finally left the parlor that Miaozhen noticed their presence. She immediately stopped in her tracks, subconsciously attempting to greet third young master and madam, but it was impossible for her to catch up with them considering the speed at which He Sanlang was dragging Chu Lian away. The servants by Maya's hen's side stared after the tall figure of He Changdi with dazed looks. "Sister Miaozhen, is that third young master?" Miaozhen nodded. Her brows knitted together, but she didn't speak. She looked away and continued heading towards Countess Jean Gan's bedroom. Chapter 481, To Manage the Household. 2. Chu Lian seemed to have her mind elsewhere while He Changdi pulled her along. Her mother-in-law, Countess Jean Gan, had requested for sour candied hawthorns, while the pregnant Miaozhen just happened to be craving sour foods. Was this really just a coincidence? As her mind was preoccupied, Chu Lian didn't notice the dark clouds gathering on He Sanlang's handsome face. The couple continued walking in silence for a good distance. When they arrived at the garden outside of Songtao Court, He Sanlang suddenly stopped short and led Chu Lian over to an octagonal pavilion nearby. He stood with his back against the wind and used his tall figure to shield Chu Lian from the chilly breeze. "Lianer, you don't have to make the candied hawthorns anymore." Chu Lian was still lost in her thoughts. Upon hearing this statement from her husband, she let out a confused "huh" and looked up at He Changdi. It was only then that she finally noticed the peculiar expression on his face. When met with Chu Lian's clear and innocent eyes, despite having already lived one lifetime, He Changdi didn't know what to say. He pursed his lips and extended his arm to take Chu Lian's small and soft figure into his embrace. The feeling of his wife lying peacefully in his arms made him sigh contentedly. With a possessive tone, he proclaimed, "You are my wife, you don't need to cook for anybody else." Despite how baffling and awkward his words were and how controlling they seemed, Chu Lian still felt warm and fuzzy inside. Chu Lian snuggled into his chest for a bit, before she raised her head and stared at him. "It's your mother we're talking about, she's not just anybody." He Changdi didn't reply this time. He tightened his arms around her and turned his gaze out towards the frozen lake which had yet to melt, with a profound look in his eyes that probably no one would understand. In his previous life, Miaozhen had miscarried, and the culprit had been Chu Lian. Was the mastermind in the shadows trying to pull something again? At Qingxi Hall, the brazier in the parlor was burning brightly and the walls were heated, so the room was as warm as spring. Senior servant Lu was feeling hot in her cotton jacket, but the matriarch who sat on the heated bed felt that it was still chilly. Senior servant Lu took a porcelain bowl with the sign of longevity painted on it from another servant and carried it over to matriarch. "Matriarch, perhaps this servant should ask great Dr. Miao to check on you. Your health is a far cry from before." Matriarch waved her hand to reject that notion, unnecessary. "Putting aside the fact that great Dr. Miao just gave me a checkup 2 days ago, this illness of mine can only be cured by a deity. You don't have to trouble great Dr. Miao." Senior servant Lu let out a soft sigh. Matriarch had too many worries on her mind and she was getting old, which was why her health had declined so much. To have a healthy body, one had to have a clear mind, so it was indeed pointless to rely on great Dr. Meow to cure the matriarch. No matter how great a doctor is, they couldn't possibly restore vigor that had been sapped away by time. Nevertheless, you should still drink this bowl of medicinal soup, matriarch. Matriarch, he didn't reject her this time. She accepted the bowl and drank 2 mouthfuls of it. Finding it tasteless, she put it to one side. She dismissed the other servants waiting upon her in the room before taking senior servant Liu's hand into her own. She asked seriously, "Shang Yun, what do you think about Sanlang's wife?" Senior servant Liu was stunned by this sudden question, but she immediately realized what was on matriarch's mind. Senior servant Liu smiled and said, "Matriarch, you must be thinking about letting third young madam manage the household, right?" Matriarch, he looked at her with surprise. "You old fox, I can't hide anything from you." Senior servant Luke started massaging matriarch's shoulders as she spoke. "This servant may be overstepping her bounds, but I believe that third young madam is the best choice for managing the household in our estate. It's obvious just from looking at Songtao Court and Gillen Restaurant. Hasn't third young madam done well beyond expectations for both of them?" Third young master also seemed very pleased with third young madam. The couple looked like they were joined at the hip when they came for their morning greetings earlier. How enviable. After senior servant Luke gave her opinion, matriarch he fell into deep contemplation. Noticing the silence of the matriarch, senior servant Lu didn't disrupt her from her thoughts and just continued massaging her gently instead. A long while later, matriarch he sighed deeply. "How could I possibly be unaware of how well Sanlang's wife has done? However, she's still so young. When all's said and done, she's just a mere 16 years of age. She's only a little older than Yinjin." Hearing this statement from matriarch senior servant Lu realized that the matriarch had already come to her own conclusion in her heart. She stayed silent now, knowing that the matriarch didn't fully trust third young madam. If the matriarch did not truly believe in someone, even if she tried persuading otherwise, the matriarch wouldn't waver at all. She might even damage the friendly relationship that they had cultivated over the years. While the master and servant shared a private conversation in the room, a maidservant outside the room announced that Leader Mo was requesting an audience. When matriarch he shot senior servant Lu a look, senior servant Lu bobbed in acknowledgement and headed out to bring Leader Mo in. Mo Chengue scanned the parlor the very moment he entered. He relaxed when he noticed that there were no outsiders around. He greeted matriarch with a bow. The matriarch had him take a seat and ordered senior servant Lu to bring tea for him. Once he had settled down, the matriarch asked, "Leader Mo, is something the matter?" The guards of House Jingon worked in shifts under a schedule specially planned by Heir Jingon, He Changqi. Except in the cases of emergencies or matters concerning the inner court, the guards normally wouldn't request to meet the matriarch. However, looking at Mo Chengue, he seemed to have a special reason for coming to visit her. Leader Mo mulled over the question for a moment and finally nodded. "Matriarch, there's a matter that I have been brooding over for some time. Since the Count isn't around, I've decided to report this matter to you." 15 minutes later, Leader Mo departed from Qingxi Hall, leaving behind an alarmed matriarch and senior servant Lu. There was a complicated look in matriarch's eyes. She had never expected Sanlang's wife to have been abducted while at the northern border. Furthermore, she had spent the night out. Although the Great Wu dynasty was starting to become more open-minded, that was only when compared to the previous dynasty. Even though women in this dynasty had more freedom than before, the reputation of noble ladies were still regarded with utmost importance. Chapter 482, Protective of his wife. 1. Once a woman's reputation was damaged, she faced the possibility of being divorced and abandoned by her husband's family. If the lady in question was not married, it might even affect the marriage prospects of the other ladies in the family. Senior servant Lu abruptly came back to her senses. She took a careful peek at the matriarch's expression. When she saw a grim expression on the matriarch, she knew that things were going to turn bad. She pondered over the matter and decided to help mediate a little. Matriarch, this is a situation that we didn't experience personally. There are probably things we don't know about this matter. Third young master and third young madam are so loving with each other. It's clear that nothing could have possibly happened to third young madam. Please don't overthink things. While matriarch he still had an awful expression on her face, she kept her rationality. She turned a disapproving look on senior servant Lu. Shang-yun, you need to remember who your master is. Senior servant Lu trembled and her face instantly paled. She kept her head lowered and remained silent at the side. She stood there with uncertainty and anxiety for a long moment before she heard the matriarch speak again. All right, I was too harsh with my words earlier. Don't let any hint of this news leak out. We don't know the actual details of what happened at the northern border. However, in the meantime, send someone to monitor the third branch over the next few days. Also, I don't want to hear any more regarding the matter of letting Sanlang's wife manage the household affairs. Senior servant Lu was shaken to her core. She would never have thought that third young madam's trip to the northern border would cause the relationship between the matriarch and third young madam to break apart. What were they to do now? Judging by how things were going, House Jingan would still need to rely on the third branch to keep their prestige in the future. Even if she didn't want to admit, senior servant Lu understood in her heart that the matriarch was getting old. She asked worriedly, then the household affairs. Matriarch he coughed a few times, her old age now showing in her demeanor. I'll manage the household affairs for now. If I can't bear it, since Miss Ing is back now, she can help out with the management. Senior servant Lu completely hadn't expected that the matriarch had made such a decision in her heart. She couldn't believe her ears. Letting eldest madam manage the household? Considering eldest madam's misconduct when she was younger, this didn't seem like a reliable solution. The worry in senior servant Liu's heart only deepened. Chu Lian was peacefully spending her days in Songtao Court, unaware that leader Mo had told matriarchy what happened at the northern border in secret. After mulling it over for some time, Chu Lian still decided to make some candied hawthorns and send them over to Countess Jingan. Although He Changdi disagreed, she couldn't really offend her mother-in-law by refusing. Of course, Chu Lian wasn't stupid. She sent someone over to Great Dr. Miao to make an inquiry before instructing the maidservants to prepare the ingredients. She made them with her own hands this time, without any help from her maidservants. The candied hawthorns were ready just before dinner. She personally sent them over to Countess Jingan's room after placing them in a food container. Chu Lian had made more than enough, so she prepared another box to bring over to Prince Wei's estate for the following day. Royal Princess Duanjia was a glutton. If she didn't bring some food over, the princess would probably complain. That night, He Changdi was rather well behaved when they slept. He had finally gotten his first taste of pleasure and it was even harder for him to restrain himself now. However, when he thought of how Chu Lian's body hadn't recovered from their first night, all he did was to help her apply some medicine before kissing and caressing her to temporarily satisfy his desires. In the end, he left to go take a bath in the bathroom. Chu Lian slept soundly all the way till morning. The furnace next to her was already gone, so she knew that He Changdi had gone to the martial arts arena again. She stayed snug and warm in bed until He Changdi returned. The couple ate breakfast in their own room before heading to Qingxi Hall for the usual morning greeting. Today, He Ying and her daughter were also present when they arrived. The tall and slender He Changdi was wearing a long black robe embroidered with auspicious clouds on the hem today. A simple jade ornament hung at his waist while his hair was tied up into a high bun, exposing his forehead. His handsome and cold face was like the first ice formed on the surface of a lake during winter and he was emitting an imposing aura from his body. After training in the military, Xianlang had lost some of his gloominess, in exchange for a more mature and steady composure that would seem more dependable to a woman. Despite his stern temperament, his actions were thoughtful and caring as he reached out and supported his wife as she lifted her feet to cross the doorstep. Ying didn't know if it was just her imagination, but she felt that there was something different about her nephew's wife today. She seemed even more beautiful as compared to the past couple of days. She was like a graceful rose that was beginning to bloom, exuding a light and attractive scent. Miss Pan was seated next to Ying and staring dazedly at Xianlang. The couple bobbed in greeting towards matriarch He. The matriarch's expression wasn't very good and she simply waved her hand in acceptance. For some reason, Chu Lian felt that matriarch He's attitude towards her seemed to be colder than before. Chapter 483, Protective of his wife. 2. Matriarch He started speaking after everyone in the parlor had settled down. She looked over Chu Lian first. The young lady was wearing a lilac dress that cinched at the waist, paired with a jacket that buttoned down the front. Her hair had been combed into a style that was currently popular in the capital. A ruby chain headdress shone against her dark hair, which made her skin appear even more fair and smooth. The bright smile on her face made her a picture-perfect beauty. Matriarch He suddenly felt somewhat displeased with her granddaughter-in-law, who seemed to be blossoming into her looks. However, there wasn't a single hint of her inner thoughts showing on her facial expression as she asked, Xianlang's wife, are you going out today? Chu Lian nodded upon hearing the matriarch's question, replying to grandmother, Royal Princess Duanjia sent an invitation yesterday. Since I happen to be free today, I wanted to pay a visit to Prince Wei's estate. Ying and Pan Nianjun were shocked and they heard her words. It was out of their expectations that the first person Chu Lian would visit upon returning to the capital was Royal Princess Duanjia. They had heard about the status of Royal Princess Duanjia. Pan Nianjun had also personally met Royal Princess Duanjia that day at the birthday banquet in Prince Wei's estate. Royal Princess Duanjia had a high status by birth. She also had a haughty and cold personality, which meant that she didn't interact much with other noble ladies. Pan Nianjun had seen how several legitimate daughters of noble families had tried to chat with Royal Princess Duanjia at Princess Wei's banquet and how they had been coldly rejected. A personage like Royal Princess Duanjia had actually sent an invitation to Chu Lian post-haste. Pan Nianjun was shaken to the core by this bit of news. Ying was surprised as well, but she had already begun making her own plans. Matriarch He wasn't really surprised by this, since she knew that Chu Lian had a good relationship with Royal Princess Duanjia. She had also gone to Prince Wei's estate often before going to the northern border. Thus, the matriarch simply stated, Princess Wei provided much assistance during your journey to the northern border. You should indeed pay her a visit in person to express your gratitude. When I visited Prince Wei's estate some time ago, Princess Wei even asked after you. Don't forget your manners when you go today. Chu Lian's expression showed that she was listening very seriously. When the matriarch finished speaking, she nodded in response. Although there was nothing wrong with matriarch He's words, Chu Lian could sense the difference in the matriarch's attitude. Her words were polite, but she seemed to be completely ignoring her obligation as an elder member of the family. If her attitude was the same as before, matriarch He would have instructed the servants to help prepare a suitable gift. After all, Prince Wei's estate had really provided much-needed help throughout the trip to the northern border. Moreover, Chu Lian wasn't the only one who benefited from their help. It could be said that Prince Wei's estate had taken care of House Jinggan as a whole. Otherwise, Princess Wei wouldn't have invited matriarch He to her important birthday banquet. Ying quickly shot her mother a look. She stared at matriarch He with pleading eyes. When the matriarch made eye contact with her daughter, she was momentarily stunned. It didn't take long before her heart softened. She still felt a little guilty when she thought of the cold treatment her only daughter had received upon returning to the capital. The matriarch had the intention to help her daughter settle in the capital. Although her daughter had been rather rebellious when she was younger, she had already matured with age and she was able to comport herself with proper etiquette now. The only problem was that she still had a bad reputation, especially as a widow who had returned to her maiden family. Thus, she wasn't very welcome in the social circles of the noblewomen in the capital. The matriarch had brought her daughter and granddaughter along to several banquets, so she had personally seen her daughter being excluded. It was inevitable that matriarchy would feel uncomfortable with this situation. Although she blamed those noble ladies for only pandering to power, her daughter had indeed been a little too deviant in the past. Therefore, there was nothing she could do about her exclusion from noble society. However, if her daughter and granddaughter could get on friendly terms with Royal Princess Duanjia and Princess Wei, then there might be a favorable turn to this situation. The matriarch couldn't bear her daughter's earnest pleading for long. She let out an awkward cough before asking, "Sanlang's wife, are you going to Prince Wei's estate alone today?" While Chu Lian thought that the matriarch's tone had changed rather quickly, she hadn't realized that it was related to He Ying and her daughter. Thus, she answered truthfully. "Husband is also going, but he's stopping by the left military guards first." The road to Prince Wei's estate and the left military guards happened to be in opposing directions. Matriarch, he smiled kindly, "Since you're going by yourself, then take Miss Pan along with you. You're all about the same age as Royal Princess Duanjia. There'll be plenty to talk about with three young ladies together." Pan Nianjun hadn't expected her grandmother to say this. Delight appeared on her face. She would be able to interact more with third cousin like this. Hesitation flared up in Chu Lian's heart, but she didn't let it show on her face. She shot a nonchalant glance at the matriarch, before turning her gaze on eldest madam and her daughter. Although she was unhappy, as a granddaughter-in-law, she couldn't reject grandmother up front when she had made such a request. Matriarch, he was obviously using her to help He Ying and her daughter make some connections. He Chengde's cold voice resounded just as Chu Lian was about to agree. "Grandmother, I need to accompany Lianer to Prince Wei's estate first. Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia have been taking great care of Lianer. As her husband, it's improper that I haven't paid them a visit them yet. Thus, it would be inconvenient for cousin to follow along." He Chengde spoke with a cool tone that brooked no argument. The emperor had placed him in an important position, so even matriarch he had to give some face to her youngest grandson. "If that's so, then the two of you should leave earlier. Miss Pan, you won't go along today. Sanlang's wife can bring her along next time. Grandmother, thank you for your understanding. It's getting late, so Lianer and I will take our leave first." Matriarch he waved her hand and dismissed the couple. He Chengde pulled Chu Lian up with him and they both bowed towards matriarch he before leaving Qingxi Hall. As soon as they left, He Ying let all of her dissatisfaction show on her face. She complained with indignation, "Mother, is Sanlang looking down on us? If Sanlang dislikes us, then I can't continue living in this estate. I'll bring Nianjun back to Xiyang tomorrow morning." Pan Nianjun was similarly stunned. She hadn't thought that He Chengde would actually refuse grandmother and leave her in the estate. Matriarch he was getting a headache from the sound of her daughter's wailing. Her heart was also pent up with frustration. Of course she had noticed that He Sanlang had done that to protect Chu Lian. There was a hint of anger in her voice when she spoke. "What's there to cry about? If it weren't for all the preposterous things you've done in the past, would Sanlang have rejected you on the spot?" Chapter 484, Considerate. 1. Matriarch he had only mentioned her daughter's mistakes from the past in the heat of the moment. The moment she said it, regret overcame her when her daughter's cries turned even more aggrieved. She sighed deeply. "All right, that's enough crying. They have a lot of socializing to do because they have just returned. Just wait for a few more days, and I'll have Sanlang's wife take Miss Pan around. Matriarchy's promise immediately stopped Ying's sobbing. She lifted her head with a face full of tears and spoke in a hoarse voice, "Mother, do you mean that for real?" Matriarchy grabbed Ying's hand and a slight smile finally surfaced on her face. "You're my own flesh and blood, when have I ever lied to you?" The mistakes Ying made in her youth were already matters long past. She had finally gotten to see her daughter after so many years apart. How could she bear to see her sad? After leaving Qingxi Hall, Sanlang and Chu Lian didn't return to Songtao Court. Instead, they headed straight to the outer court to embark on their trip to Prince Wei's mansion. Sanlang personally helped Chu Lian up the carriage and immediately followed after her with a single stride of his long legs. Xian tactfully went to the next carriage instead of sitting with her master as usual. Chu Lian stared at him with her clear eyes, her mouth still slightly agape from the surprise. "Didn't Lai Wei bring leaping clouds out for you earlier?" He Changdi glanced at her and casually straightened out his robes before replying, "Who said that the horse has to be ridden if it's brought out?" For lack of a good response, Chu Lian rolled her eyes at him. The noblemen of the capital rarely sat in carriages unless there was some physical reason keeping them from riding. Wasn't he afraid of getting laughed at by others for sitting in a carriage with her like this instead of riding on a horse like a man? Sanlang's dark pupils were focused on Chu Lian. Seeing her luscious lips and almond-shaped eyes, he couldn't help swallowing his saliva. He reached out and pulled her against his side. Chu Lian nearly let out a startled cry, but she held it in. Once she managed to calm down, she realized that she was already sitting on her lunatic husband's lap. Despite the contrast between his black robe and her bright lilac dress, they gave off an inexplicable sense of harmony when put together. Sanlang held the woman in his embrace tightly and dropped a light peck on her forehead. The ruby that hung over her forehead made her little face all the more brilliant. Chu Lian was already a little uncomfortable when she realized she could feel a certain reaction from his very male body even through his clothes. She started struggling a little and complained with an enraged whisper, "He Changdi, can't you be a little more decent?" Sanlang's sharp brows furrowed together and he used a little more force to keep her flailing body in place. He held her soft earlobe between his lips and gently nibbled on it. His husky voice resounded in her ear, "Stop moving, or I might truly lose control." His deep and magnetic voice and the warm breath caressing her ear caused her whole body to turn limp. As a result, she turned completely stiff and motionless on Changdi's chest. Changdi petted her black hair and kissed the top of her head, "Smart girl." Chu Lian leaned against Changdi's broad and muscled chest like this for a while. When she finally felt his horniness fade away, she gulped down her saliva and spoke up. She raised her head and put some distance between them. Her head tilted to one side as she looked at his handsome and chilly face and stared deeply into his gentle eyes. Chu Lian suddenly pouted and laid back down on his chest. With an aggrieved tone, she asked, Changdi, why does it feel like grandmother doesn't like me anymore?" Sanlang's heart melted from the needy look in his wife's eyes. With great difficulty, he opened his mouth and spoke in a deep voice, "Call me hubby." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.